Explosions tear apart ancient stone walls as Allied artillery rains down on the heights of Monte Cassino. Soldiers claw their way up steep rocky slopes under machine gun fire, every advance met with a storm of bullets. The monastery above looms like a fortress silhouetted against the sky, the key to Rome itself. Tonight, we take you through the entire Battle of Monte Cassino. 4 brutal assaults, months of attrition, and a campaign that tested the courage of Allied and Axis troops alike. From the freezing valleys of January 1944 to the final breakthrough that opened the road to Rome, this is the full story, told in vivid detail. So settle in, dim the lights, and join us as we relive one of the most dramatic and costly struggles of the Second World War. Before we begin, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing our worldwide history family. The year is 1943. Across the battlefields of Europe, a new front has opened, one that would prove as grueling, as costly, and as decisive as any in the Second World War. The Allies, victorious in North Africa, had crossed the Mediterranean, believing that Italy, the so-called soft underbelly of Europe, would yield quickly to their advance. Yet what awaited them was not softness, but steel. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 had been swift, and the fall of Mussolini soon followed. The Italian government surrendered, switching sides in the war. But the German response was immediate and ruthless. Under the iron hand of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Wehrmacht dug in, transforming the mountainous Italian terrain into a fortress of natural and man-made defences. At the heart of this defensive masterpiece lay the Gustav Line, a formidable barrier stretching across the width of Italy, anchored in the west by the rugged peaks around Cassino, and guarded by the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino itself. To understand why Monte Cassino mattered, one must look northward to Rome. The Eternal City was more than a symbol, it was a gateway. Beyond Rome lay the open plains, roads, and railways that led to northern Italy, and eventually to the heart of Germany's European empire. If the Allies could capture Rome, they would deliver a devastating psychological blow to the Axis and open the road for further campaigns. But the road to Rome was blocked by geography itself. Towering mountains, narrow valleys, and rivers that swelled with winter rains created natural choke points. German engineers reinforced these features with minefields, machine gun nests, and artillery placements that commanded every approach. The Gustav Line was no mere line of trenches. It was a wall of fire stretching across Italy, designed to bleed the Allies white. And there, at its centre, loomed Monte Cassino, a mountain crowned with a 1,000-year-old abbey, a monastery that had survived centuries of storms, invasions, and wars. From its summit, the Germans commanded a panoramic view of the Liri Valley below, the only feasible corridor through which tanks and mechanized units could push toward Rome. Without control of Cassino, the Allies could not move forward. For the Allied commanders, General Harold Alexander, General Mark Clark of the US Fifth Army, and the multinational coalition of British, American, French, Indian, New Zealander, and Polish troops, the task was clear but daunting. Break the Gustav Line, take Cassino, open the road to Rome. Yet what seemed like a single operation would evolve into a drawn-out struggle of unimaginable brutality. Between January and May 1944, the Battle of Monte Cassino would rage in 4 separate assaults, each more desperate than the last. Thousands of men would fight and die for every ridge, every ruined farmhouse, every street of the shattered town below the monastery. Monte Cassino was not simply a battlefield, it was a crucible. It tested the endurance of soldiers drawn from every corner of the globe, fighting side by side against an enemy as skilled as any they had ever faced. It was a struggle of mud and blood, of courage and despair, of determination clashing against immovable stone. In this chapter, we stand at the threshold of that story. The Allies, pressing northward, their eyes fixed on Rome, believed they were advancing toward a prize within reach. Instead, they found themselves halted by a fortress in the mountains. A fortress that would demand months of sacrifice and turn the ancient stones of Cassino into symbols of both suffering and endurance. The Battle of Monte Cassino was about more than strategy, more than terrain. It was about the soul of the war itself. Could the Allies, with their combined armies, break the German hold on Italy and prove that even the strongest fortress could be overcome? Or would Monte Cassino stand as an immovable obstacle, a place where ambition and resolve were ground into dust? This is the story of that struggle. The road to Rome ran through Cassino, and the road to Cassino would be written in blood. When Mussolini's fascist regime collapsed in 1943, Adolf Hitler knew that Italy's fall could unravel Germany's southern flank. The Allies, now ashore on the peninsula, would not stop at Sicily or Naples. Their eyes were on Rome, and beyond it, on the Alpine passes that opened a road into the Reich itself. To Hitler, Italy could not be allowed to collapse quickly. It had to become a shield, a fortress that would delay the Allies, bleed them, and buy Germany precious time. The man chosen to shape this defense was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a master of both air strategy and ground command. Kesselring was charismatic, pragmatic, and possessed of a tenacity that made him one of the most respected German commanders of the war. His task was monumental: to transform the length of central Italy into a barrier so formidable that even the combined might of Britain, America, France, and their allies would break upon it like waves against stone. Thus was born the Gustav Line, the backbone of a larger defensive system stretching across the waste of Italy. But it was not a single line of trenches. It was an intricate web of fortifications, rivers, and mountain bastions layered to exploit every advantage the terrain offered. At the center of this fortress stood the Apennine Mountains, running like a spine down Italy's length. Kesselring and his engineers carved defences into their slopes, turning peaks into gun positions, ridges into natural walls, and valleys into death traps. Every hill could conceal artillery. Every gorge could funnel attacking forces into kill zones. To reinforce these natural barriers, the Germans mined the ground with ruthless efficiency. Entire fields and roads were seeded with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, barbed wire snarled approaches, machine gun nests covered river crossings with intersecting arcs of fire. The Germans understood that Italy's narrow valleys forced any attacker into predictable routes, and they ensured those routes were lined with steel and fire. One of the most formidable obstacles of the Gustav Line was the Rapido River. Swollen by winter rains, it became a torrent that split the Allied approach. For infantry, it was a freezing, waist-deep nightmare, made worse by German artillery zeroed in on every crossing point. For tanks and vehicles, it was nearly impassable without bridging equipment, and bridging under fire was suicidal. Behind the Rapido lay Cassino, and above Cassino, the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, towering 1,700 feet above the valley floor. From its summit, the defenders held a commanding view of the Lieri Valley, the only corridor broad enough to support a mechanized advance toward Rome. If the Gustav Line was the lock, Monte Cassino was the key. Yet Cassino was only one strong point among many. Across the peninsula, German engineers anchored the line to rivers like the Garigliano and the Sangro. They constructed bunkers of reinforced concrete, camouflaged artillery batteries, and carefully prepared fallback positions. The Gustav Line was not a single wall to be breached. It was a fortress in depth. Break through one barrier and another awaited just beyond. What made Kesselring's defense so formidable was his philosophy of economy. He did not attempt to defend every inch of ground, but instead concentrated his strength at the most vital points, places where terrain favored defense, where the Allies had no choice but to attack. There, German paratroopers, panzer grenadiers, and mountain troops waited, skilled, disciplined, and deadly. To the Allies advancing northward, the Gustav Line soon revealed itself as more than a military obstacle. It was a psychological wall. Weeks turned into months as their progress stalled before its defences. Soldiers spoke of Italy not as the soft underbelly promised by Winston Churchill, but as the tough old gut of Europe, a place where every step forward demanded blood. In this chapter of the war, the Gustav Line became more than Hitler's mountain fortress. It became a test of wills. For the Germans, it was a chance to prove that they could hold back the Allied tide. For the Allies, it was an ordeal that demanded not just courage, but persistence in the face of repeated failure. And at the heart of this confrontation stood Monte Cassino, its monastery walls gazing down upon the valley, like silent witnesses to the storm that was about to break. The Allies knew, to reach Rome, they would have to shatter the Gustav line, and to shatter the Gustav line, they would first have to conquer Cassino. At the heart of the battle stood the small town of Cassino, and towering above it, the great Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, a site of immense cultural, spiritual, and historical significance. For over 1400 years it had been a beacon of faith and learning, founded by Saint Benedict himself in the 6th century. Perched high upon a rocky hill, its walls of white stone shone like a fortress in the sunlight, visible for miles across the valley. To the devout, it was a house of God, a place where monks had prayed, written, and preserved ancient knowledge through centuries of turbulence. To scholars and pilgrims, it was a monument to the endurance of Western civilization itself. But in 1944, this holy sanctuary was drawn unwillingly into the maelstrom of modern warfare. The town of Cassino, lying at the base of the mountain, had already borne the scars of occupation and bombardment. Its narrow streets, once home to families, shops and markets, became avenues of ruin as artillery pounded the stone houses into rubble. Civilians who had not fled were trapped between two armies, huddling in basements and cellars, terrified of each new explosion. German forces transformed the town into a bastion of defense, constructing bunkers, fortifying ruined buildings, and using every shattered wall as a strong point. Cassino was no longer merely a town. It had become a fortress within the larger fortress of the Gustav line, a killing ground where attackers would bleed for every street, every intersection, every staircase. Above it, the monastery loomed as both a physical and symbolic presence. For the Allies looking up from the valley, it was impossible to ignore. Its high position seemed to dominate the entire battlefield. From its commanding height, one could look out over the approaches from the south, across the Rapido River and the roads that led toward Rome. Allied commanders grew convinced that the Germans must be using the monastery as an observation post, directing artillery fire onto their advancing troops. To them, its massive stone walls and lofty position made it not just a monastery, but an ideal fortress. If not in practice, then certainly in perception. Yet the truth was more complicated. For months, the German commander, Field Marshal Kesselring, had forbidden his men from occupying the sacred building, understanding its cultural importance and fearing the propaganda disaster of violating it. The monastery itself was empty of troops, but its surroundings, the slopes, caves, terraces and ridgelines, were indeed alive with German positions, machine guns, mortars, and well-concealed nests that rained death upon Allied soldiers below. This convergence of faith and war created a tragic irony. A house of prayer, untouched for centuries by conquest, was now encircled by armies wielding the most destructive weapons of modern warfare. Allied soldiers, many of them from distant corners of the world, Indians, New Zealanders, Poles, Britons, Americans, French and more, looked up at the monastery with a mixture of awe, frustration and bitterness. To them, its imposing walls symbolized the obstacle that barred the road to Rome. They came to see Monte Cassino not only as a military challenge, but as an almost mythic adversary, a symbol of the stubborn German defense that seemed unbreakable. As the siege tightened, the monastery's monks and remaining civilians found themselves in an impossible situation. The monks continued their prayers even as artillery shells landed around them, their chants mingling with the thunder of distant guns. Some begged for the monastery to be spared, arguing that its destruction would be an act of sacrilege against history and faith. But as Allied casualties mounted in the valley below, and as frustration grew over repeated failures to dislodge the German defenders, pressure built for decisive action. The monastery, sacred and silent, became the focal point of the entire battle. Its fate, and that of the town beneath it, would soon be sealed in one of the most controversial and destructive decisions of the entire Italian campaign. The new year of 1944 opened with bitter cold, biting winds and a grim determination among the Allied high command. They had reached the Gustav line after a long and exhausting march up the Italian peninsula, and now Rome, the great prize, lay tantalizingly close, only 80 miles beyond Cassino. But between them and the Eternal City stood the most formidable barrier of all, the monastery on the hill, the shattered town beneath it, and the icy mountains that framed the Liri Valley. It was here, in January 1944, that the Allies launched their first full-scale assault on Cassino, an attack that would test the endurance of men and machines alike against the ruthless power of nature and the unyielding resolve of the German defence. The French Expeditionary Corps, composed largely of Moroccan and Algerian troops hardened by mountain warfare in North Africa, was among the first to be thrown into the fray. Commanded by General Alphonse Juin, these soldiers were uniquely suited to the jagged terrain of the Aurunchi and Abruzzi mountains that anchored the Gustav line. Clad in heavy wool uniforms and carrying only what they could on their backs, they advanced through frozen ridges, scaling treacherous paths where even mules faltered. The French colonial troops fought with skill and ferocity, often surprising German patrols with sudden night attacks in the high ground. Yet their bravery could not alter the fundamental problem. The terrain itself was nearly impassable, and every attempt to push forward came under the merciless gaze of German artillery observers who directed shellfire with deadly accuracy. To the east, the Americans of the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, were ordered to attempt a river crossing that has since become infamous. Their task was to ford the Rapido River, a fast-moving, ice-cold torrent swollen by winter rains. Engineers struggled to erect pontoon bridges while under fire, but German machine gunners and mortars were waiting. As the Texans tried to cross in rubber boats, the current swept many men downstream, while others were cut down before they could reach the far bank. Entire companies were annihilated within minutes. The river became a graveyard, its dark waters filled with broken boats and the cries of the wounded. By the end of the operation, hundreds of Americans lay dead or captured, and the assault had achieved nothing. Survivors would later recall it as one of the most futile and tragic episodes of the entire Italian campaign. Meanwhile, within the shattered ruins of Cassino itself, the German defence was being orchestrated by one of the most formidable fighting units of the war, the 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjäger. These were not ordinary infantrymen, they were elite paratroopers, veterans of campaigns stretching from Crete to the Eastern Front, hand-picked for their discipline, toughness, and fighting spirit. Under the command of General Richard Heydrich, the Fallschirmjäger transformed the ruins into a labyrinth of death. Each collapsed wall became a fortress, cellars were converted into machine gun nests, streets were booby-trapped, alleys mined, and sniper positions concealed among the rubble. The town became an urban battlefield of the most nightmarish kind, where progress could be measured only in yards, and each ruined building had to be taken in hand-to-hand combat. The weather compounded the misery. Snow fell across the mountains, and freezing rain turned the valley floor into a morass of mud. Vehicles bogged down, mules collapsed under their loads, and soldiers shivered in wet uniforms that never seemed to dry. The cold gnawed at fingers and toes, frostbite claimed its victims, and the wounded often lay unattended for hours in no man's land, their cries mingling with the whistling of shells. For the Allied troops, many of them drawn from the warm climates of North Africa, India, or the American South, the bitter European winter was as much an enemy as the German paratroopers. Despite repeated attempts, the Allied assaults in January made little headway. Every advance was met with ferocious counterattacks, every breach sealed by disciplined German firepower. The mountains and valleys echoed with the thunder of artillery, but the line held. The Allies had underestimated the Gustav line's strength, and they had paid for it in blood. By the end of January, the first great assault on Cassino had collapsed in exhaustion and failure. The Allied soldiers were forced to withdraw, leaving behind fields littered with the dead and towns reduced to rubble. Yet, even in defeat, the Allies learned a grim lesson, that this was no ordinary battlefield, no mere stepping stone on the road to Rome. Cassino was a fortress in every sense, natural, man-made, and spiritual, and the men defending it were determined to fight to the last. For the Allies, it was clear that more attacks would be needed, each bloodier than the last. And as winter deepened, Cassino became less a battlefield than a crucible, a place where armies were ground down against the stone of the mountains and the will of their opponents. The Rapido River crossing of January 1944 remains etched in the history of the Italian campaign as one of the most ill-fated and tragic moments of the Allied struggle. Ordered into the assault was the US 36th Infantry Division, comprised largely of men from Texas, many of them citizen soldiers who had already endured a grueling trek up the Italian peninsula. Their mission was clear, yet suicidal: to force a crossing of the Rapido River, establish a bridgehead, and open the way toward the heavily fortified Gustav line. The reality on the ground, however, was far more nightmarish than any plan on paper. The Rapido itself was not a mighty river by European standards. It was shallow in places, narrow in others, its banks muddy and treacherous. But under German occupation, it had been transformed into a deadly obstacle. The Wehrmacht, anticipating that the Allies would seek to break through here, had reinforced every possible crossing point with mines, booby traps, machine gun nests, and interlocking fields of fire. Barbed wire was strung across approaches to the river, artillery was zeroed in on potential crossing routes, and the German paratroopers of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division watched every movement from the opposite bank with ruthless precision. On the night of January 20th, 1944, the men of the 36th began their attempt. Inflatable rubber boats were dragged to the water's edge, often under direct and punishing fire, before they even touched the river. The current, swollen by winter rains, carried many boats downstream before they could land. Men tried to paddle across as shells exploded in the water around them, ripping through boats and flinging soldiers into the icy current. Some drowned, dragged under by their heavy gear. Others scrambled to the far bank, only to be cut down instantly by waiting German guns. Despite their courage, the assault turned into a massacre. By the second day, battalion after battalion had been thrown into the crossing attempt, and each was met with the same fate. Communications were poor, coordination broke down, and the engineers attempting to construct makeshift bridges were obliterated by artillery fire. American infantry who did reach the far side found themselves isolated without sufficient cover or reinforcements and were rapidly overwhelmed. The riverbank itself became a killing field, bodies tangled in the mud, boats shredded to pieces, the cries of the wounded drowned by the thunder of German guns. In just 2 days, the 36th Infantry Division lost nearly 2,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It was a staggering cost for no gain. The river remained firmly in German hands, the Gustav line unbroken, and the Allied command shaken by the human toll of their failed gamble. Survivors who staggered back across the Rapido described it as walking into death itself, a mission doomed from the start. For the men of the 36th Division, the Rapido was not just a battle, but a scar. Many of them would never forgive the commanders who ordered the assault, seeing it as a needless sacrifice, a futile throwing away of lives against an immovable defense. In later years, the disaster would spark heated debate in Congress, where veterans of the division demanded accountability for the orders that had condemned them. Yet, in the larger tapestry of Monte Cassino, the Rapido River assault stands as both a testament to the bravery of ordinary soldiers and a grim example of the human tragedy that defined so much of the Italian campaign. It revealed the ruthless strength of the Gustav line, the determination of the German defenders, and the steep, bloody price the Allies would have to pay before Rome could ever be reached. If the Gustav line had a soul, it was embodied in the men who defended its most sacred and contested stronghold, Monte Cassino. These were not ordinary troops. They were the Fallschirmjäger, Germany's paratroopers, men forged in the crucible of elite airborne training and tempered by years of hard-fought campaigns. By 1944, they were no longer leaping from the skies in daring airborne assaults. Instead, they had become Hitler's fire brigade, dispatched to the most dangerous sectors of the front to hold ground at all costs. At Monte Cassino, they would achieve near-mythic status for their defense. The Fallschirmjäger who arrived at Cassino belonged largely to the 1st Parachute Division, veterans of Crete, North Africa, and the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. Their commander, General Richard Heydrich, was both pragmatic and ruthless, and he understood that the monastery heights were the keystone of the German defensive system. With discipline drilled into them and combat experience far beyond their years, these soldiers were the ideal force to transform the mountain slopes into a fortress. From the moment they occupied the terrain, the Fallschirmjäger displayed the ingenuity that defined them. Using the rocky ground, ancient stone walls and terraced vineyards, they created an intricate web of defensive positions. Machine gun nests were concealed within ruined farmhouses, sniper hideouts were dug into caves, and observation posts were positioned with panoramic views of the Leary Valley below. Every ravine, every goat path, every natural fold of the land was mapped and fortified. Mines were sown in the approaches, booby traps hidden in rubble, and artillery zeroed in with mathematical precision on likely Allied avenues of attack. Unlike many German units that relied on rigid discipline, the Fallschirmjäger cultivated initiative at the squad level. Small groups operated with independence, shifting from position to position, making the most of cover, and harassing Allied troops with sudden bursts of fire before disappearing again into the terrain. Their camouflage was so effective that advancing soldiers often reported being fired upon from invisible positions, as if the very mountain itself had come alive with German guns. The defenders were also masters of psychological warfare. They allowed Allied patrols to creep close before unleashing devastating ambushes. They taunted their enemies across no man's land, sometimes letting captured voices on radios mislead Allied forces. Prisoners who fell into their hands often described their captors as professional, sometimes even courteous, but always unyielding. These were not men who intended to retreat. What set the Fallschirmjäger apart most, however, was their sheer endurance. Supplies were limited, rations thin, and yet morale remained high. They fought with a grim determination born of loyalty to their comrades, their reputation, and the belief that holding Cassino meant holding back the entire Allied advance on Rome. When bombs reduced the town below to rubble, the paratroopers adapted, turning ruins into ready-made bunkers. When artillery pounded their positions day after day, they simply dug deeper. Accounts from survivors tell of men living like moles in the earth, eating cold rations, sleeping in damp holes, and emerging only to fight with deadly efficiency. The monastery itself, though initially unoccupied, became a symbolic shield for their presence. While Hitler had ordered that it not be garrisoned, the slopes beneath and the town around it bristled with Fallschirmjäger positions. To the Allies looking up from the valley floor, it seemed as though the ancient Benedictine Abbey had become one with the German defense, its walls and sacred stones looming over the battlefield as a fortress of faith and war alike. For the men facing them, the Fallschirmjäger were an enemy unlike any other encountered in Italy. Allied reports marveled at their discipline, their refusal to break under overwhelming fire, and their uncanny ability to reappear after seeming annihilated. They became the mountain's ghosts, defenders who seemed to draw strength from the very monastery and its history, turning Monte Cassino into a near impregnable citadel. In truth, it was the Fallschirmjäger who gave Monte Cassino its legendary status. Without them, the mountain might have fallen in days. With them, it would take months of blood, sacrifice, and relentless assaults before the Allies could finally wrest it from their hands. Their defense of Cassino entered the annals of military history not merely as a battle, but as an epic of resistance, proof that a small, determined force, properly led and entrenched, could defy entire armies. When armies clash, it is often the civilians, those without weapons, uniforms, or orders, who bear the deepest scars. Nowhere was this truer than in Cassino, where the small Italian town and its surrounding valleys became unwilling hosts to one of the most destructive battles of the Second World War. The people of Cassino, once living quiet lives in the shadow of the Benedictine monastery, suddenly found themselves trapped between two titanic forces, their streets and homes transformed into a battlefield, their lives reduced to a daily struggle for survival. At the onset of the fighting, many families had already fled, carrying only what they could on carts or on their backs. But thousands remained, unable or unwilling to leave their homes. Some believed the sacred monastery towering above them would serve as a shield, sparing the town from destruction. Others had nowhere else to go, tied by generations to their land, their livestock, and the graves of their ancestors. When the bombardments began, those who stayed found their world collapsing. Literally, buildings crumbled into heaps of stone, fires consumed wooden rafters, and streets once bustling with markets and children's laughter turned into avenues of dust, ruin, and death. For those caught in Cassino itself, life became a grotesque parody of existence. Families huddled in cellars beneath the rubble of their homes, listening as shells screamed overhead and walls shook with every blast. When food supplies dwindled, hunger became an ever-present torment. The fields around the town, once green with wheat and olives, were scarred by shell fire and mined by retreating troops. Livestock had been slaughtered or driven away. People scavenged desperately, roots, weeds, scraps from abandoned military rations. Bread, once a daily staple, became a rare treasure. There were stories of children reduced to eating grass, of mothers breaking their meager rations into smaller and smaller pieces to stretch one meal into 3. Water, too, became a matter of life and death. Wells were contaminated by corpses, both human and animal, or destroyed by bombs. Civilians risked their lives crossing open ground to reach a spring, sometimes gunned down by snipers who mistook them for enemy soldiers. Disease spread quickly in the filth and dampness of underground shelters. Dysentery, fever, and lice tormented those already weakened by hunger. Yet even in these conditions, there were acts of resilience. Women caring for the sick with herbs gathered from shattered gardens, priests offering blessings in cellars that served as makeshift chapels, neighbors sharing the last of their food with those worse off than themselves. As the battle intensified, many fled into the hills and caves that pock-marked the rocky countryside. These caves became grim sanctuaries, dark, damp, and suffocating, yet safer than the open streets. Families lived for weeks in pitch blackness, their lives measured by the echo of artillery in the valley below. Children cried from hunger and fear, silenced by parents terrified that even a whimper might draw enemy fire. In these caves, bonds of community were forged anew. Entire groups of strangers became families, pooling resources, comforting the weak, burying the dead when the shelling ceased long enough to allow it. The monastery itself, a beacon of spirituality for centuries, became both symbol and curse for the civilians. When it was finally bombed by Allied aircraft, the destruction shattered not only ancient stone, but also the last illusions of sanctuary. Survivors described the earth heaving as wave after wave of bombs fell, cloaking the valley in smoke and ash. For many Italians watching from their hiding places, it felt as if God himself had abandoned Cassino. In the aftermath, survivors crept through the rubble in silence, searching for loved ones, for scraps of food, for any sign of hope amidst the desolation. And yet, despite the horror, stories of quiet heroism emerged. Mothers shielding their children with their own bodies during bombardments. Farmers sneaking into no man's land to dig potatoes from shattered fields. Old men guiding Allied and Axis wounded alike to safety, guided not by politics, but by a simple sense of humanity. In the darkness of caves, in the ruins of houses, in the shadow of the Abbey's broken walls, the people of Cassino clung to life with a resilience that defied the destruction around them. By the time the battle ended, Cassino as a town no longer existed. Its people, scattered, starved and broken, carried with them memories of unimaginable suffering, of hunger, fear, and endless nights under fire. Yet they also carried the memory of endurance, of survival against all odds. Their story is a reminder that the tragedy of war is not measured only in armies and empires, but in the fate of the ordinary men, women, and children who find themselves trapped in its path. High above the Liri Valley, the great Abbey of Monte Cassino had stood for centuries, a beacon of Christian faith and learning. Founded in 529 AD by Saint Benedict himself, it was more than a monastery. It was the birthplace of the Benedictine order, a centre of prayer, scholarship, and resilience through the long tides of European history. Through Lombard invasions, Norman sieges, and even Napoleonic wars, it had been rebuilt time and again. By 1944, the Abbey's towering walls and pale stone facade seemed timeless, a reminder that human civilization could endure even the most destructive storms. But in the winter of war, the monastery became something else, a symbol of bitter controversy, and ultimately a casualty of modern warfare. The Allied commanders looked upon the Abbey with suspicion and unease. From the valley floor, Cassino and its monastery loomed like a fortress in the sky. Its commanding view stretched across the Rapido and Liri valleys, controlling every road, every approach, every movement of troops below. Allied infantrymen, pinned down by deadly fire from German positions on the slopes, became convinced that the ancient walls must be housing enemy spotters and snipers. American commanders receiving reports from the front began to argue that as long as Monte Cassino Abbey stood intact, the Gustav line could never be broken. Yet the truth was more complicated. The German command, acutely aware of the Abbey's sacred status and the global backlash its violation would provoke, had deliberately avoided stationing troops inside its walls. The Fallschirmjäger had instead entrenched themselves in the surrounding slopes, bunkers, and caves, where they could pour fire into the valley while leaving the monastery technically untouched. The question soon grew into a dilemma that pitted military necessity against cultural preservation. Allied officers wrestled with conflicting intelligence reports as desperate soldiers in the field continued to insist the monastery was being used by the enemy. British commanders hesitated, wary of the international outrage that would follow such an act. But in early February 1944, with casualties mounting and morale fraying, the decision was made. The American Fifth Army, under General Mark Clark, authorized one of the most controversial actions of the war, the complete aerial bombardment of Monte Cassino Abbey. On the morning of February 15, 1944, the skies above Cassino filled with the drone of aircraft engines. Wave after wave of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchell bombers approached the Abbey, their bomb bays opening as the monastery came into view. Inside, terrified Italian civilians, men, women, children, and monks, who had sought refuge in what they believed to be a sanctuary of safety, huddled beneath the ancient walls. At 9:30 a.m., the first bombs fell. The earth shook, and within moments, centuries of art, frescoes, manuscripts, and architecture were engulfed in fire and smoke. Stone walls that had stood for 1,400 years crumbled into dust. Within 3 hours, Monte Cassino Abbey was no more, reduced to rubble, a ghost of its former majesty. The immediate aftermath was one of shock and horror. Survivors staggered from the ruins, their faces covered in ash, their lives forever scarred by the destruction of a place they had believed untouchable. Around the world, headlines carried the news, and outrage poured in from every corner. The Vatican, already navigating a precarious neutrality, condemned the act as a cultural atrocity. Scholars and historians decried the senseless loss of a jewel of Western civilization. Even among the Allied ranks, unease spread, for the hoped-for military advantage had not materialized. Ironically, the destruction of the Abbey handed the Germans a gift they could not have planned for. The Fallschirmjäger swiftly moved into the ruins, converting them into a fortress of stone and shattered walls. From the debris, they built machine gun nests and sniper positions that proved even more deadly than before. What had been an empty sanctuary, spared by German restraint, now became one of the strongest positions on the Gustav line, courtesy of the Allied bombing. The bombing of Monte Cassino remains one of the most debated decisions of the Second World War. Was it an act of strategic necessity or a colossal blunder born of desperation and flawed intelligence? Was it justified by the need to save lives in the long run, or was it, as many argued, an unforgivable crime against history and culture? What cannot be denied is the scale of the loss. With a few dozen bomb runs, mankind erased nearly 15 centuries of human achievement, leaving behind only dust and broken stones. For the soldiers in the valley, however, there was no time for reflection. The ruins of Monte Cassino were now a battlefield, and the war would grind on, even harsher than before. Yet for the world beyond Italy, the image of that smouldering abbey would remain etched into memory, a stark reminder of how modern war devoured not only human lives, but the very symbols of civilization itself. February of 1944 brought with it new Allied determination, fresh divisions, and renewed plans to take Cassino. The destruction of the Abbey in mid-February, rather than clearing the way for the Allies, had instead given the Germans yet another advantage. The shattered stones of the once proud monastery, now reduced to piles of rubble, offered natural fortifications that were even harder to dislodge than intact walls. Into this charred, cratered landscape marched men of the Indian divisions, the New Zealanders of the 2nd Division, and the British infantry, each determined to finally crack the Gustav line, where their comrades had already bled and failed. The Second Battle of Cassino began with a confidence that the monastery's fall had been the missing key, but reality soon demonstrated otherwise. The Indian 4th Division, seasoned in mountain warfare from the campaigns in North Africa, was tasked with storming the Cassino slopes. In theory, their training gave them the perfect skills to wrest control from the German paratroopers who held every inch of high ground. Yet even these battle-hardened soldiers quickly discovered that the slopes of Monte Cassino were unlike any battlefield they had ever encountered. The mountainside was a killing ground, mined, wired, and covered by interlocking fields of fire from German machine guns and mortars. Attempts to climb the shattered terraces and rocky crags were met with relentless fire. Men were cut down as they moved from cover to cover, the mountainside echoing with the sharp cracks of rifles and the dull thunder of mortars. What should have been ground measured in yards became measured instead in lives lost. Meanwhile, in the town of Cassino itself, the New Zealand 2nd Division under General Bernard Freeburg pressed its way forward through streets that were now nothing more than a maze of rubble. The town was a skeleton of twisted steel, crumbled walls, and cratered streets. Every pile of debris could conceal a German sniper, every corner a machine gun nest. The New Zealanders fought from room to room, sometimes from one half of a destroyed building to another, locked in an intimate and vicious struggle where bayonets, grenades, and sheer physical endurance mattered as much as rifles. German Fallschirmjäger, resolute and unyielding, fought like phantoms of the ruins, never allowing the attackers more than a few feet of ground before counterattacking with sudden violence. Adding to the difficulty, the winter rains turned the battlefield into a morass of mud, soaking soldiers to the bone and bogging down vehicles. Tanks, essential for breaking through German strongpoints, could barely maneuver in the swamp-like terrain. Many broke down in the mire, becoming immobile targets for German artillery. Supply lines faltered, food grew scarce, and exhaustion took a terrible toll. Even when Allied troops gained a foothold, they found themselves isolated, cut off, and vulnerable to counterstrikes. The British forces joined in, attempting to lend weight to the assaults, but the pattern repeated itself. Brave advances, heavy casualties, and little ground gained. The Germans, perched high above, were able to observe every movement, direct their artillery with devastating accuracy, and rush reserves into threatened sectors. The Abbey ruins became a fortress, a labyrinth of stone where small groups of German paratroopers could hold off entire companies of attackers. By late February, after weeks of grueling combat, the Allies were once again forced to concede that Cassino remained unbroken. Hundreds of lives had been lost, and yet the monastery heights still flew the German flag. For the soldiers of the Indian and New Zealand divisions, the bitter truth set in. Courage and sacrifice alone could not overcome the brutal combination of terrain, weather, and enemy determination. The Second Battle of Cassino ended not with victory, but with the grim silence of failure. The Gustav line stood firm, the monastery in ruins yet unyielding, and the German defenders as defiant as ever. For the Allies, it was a sobering reminder that Cassino was no ordinary battlefield. It was a fortress in every sense of the word, one that demanded still more blood and effort before it would ever fall. Among the many stories of Monte Cassino, few shine with the same aura of almost mythic endurance as that of the Gurkhas on Hangman's Hill. In late February 1944, as the Allies searched for a way to turn failure into progress, a bold plan was devised to send the fearless Gurkha battalions of the British Indian Army up the sheer slopes near the monastery. The mission was simple in outline, but near impossible in execution: to seize and hold a precarious ridge that would give the Allies a vantage point close to the shattered Abbey itself. That ridge became known to history as Hangman's Hill, an apt name for the place where survival was measured in inches and where men clung to life in the face of impossible odds. The Gurkhas, renowned across the world for their ferocity in combat and their unbreakable loyalty, climbed the jagged slopes under the cloak of night. The ascent was grueling: sheer rock faces, loose shale, and the ever-present danger of German patrols. Carrying their rifles, mortars, and the iconic curved kukri knives, they moved with the quiet efficiency of hunters in the dark. By dawn, against all expectations, they had reached the ridge, a bald, exposed spur of land just below the monastery walls. It was a position of incredible courage, but also of terrible vulnerability. From the monastery ruins and the surrounding heights, German paratroopers could rain fire down upon them at will. Almost immediately, the Gurkhas came under withering attack. Mortar shells burst around them, machine guns swept the slopes, and snipers hunted their every movement. Yet the Gurkhas dug in, carving shallow foxholes into the rocky ground, using what little cover the broken terrain afforded. Time and again, German infantry tried to dislodge them, climbing up the approaches in small, determined groups. Each time, the Gurkhas met them with ferocious resistance, pouring down fire, hurling grenades, and when the fighting closed to mere yards, charging forward with their kukris flashing. Stories spread among the Allied lines of the Gurkhas' sheer defiance, that a handful of men could repel attacks many times their number, holding the ridge as if bound to it by fate itself. But their valor came at a terrible cost. Supplies could not easily reach Hangman's Hill. The only paths were narrow goat tracks under constant enemy fire, where any man attempting to bring food, water, or ammunition risked being cut down. For days, the Gurkhas endured on starvation rations, sipping at melted snow for water, eking out their dwindling ammunition with perfect discipline. Wounded men lay beside their comrades in shallow shelters, refusing to cry out for fear of drawing German attention. Night after night, stretcher parties attempted to reach them, only to be driven back by relentless fire. The psychological strain was immense, yet the Gurkhas never wavered. Observers watching from Allied lines below were astounded that the ridge, which seemed untenable from the very beginning, still held. To the German defenders, it was as if the Gurkhas were spirits bound to the mountain, impossible to kill, impossible to frighten, and unwilling to retreat. Tales of their stand spread quickly among Allied troops, of men fighting hand-to-hand in the rubble, of patrols that slipped out in darkness to raid German positions, of comrades refusing evacuation until their unit was relieved. The name Hangman's Hill became a whispered legend, a symbol of sacrifice and pride. Eventually, after days of isolation, hunger, and near-constant bombardment, the Gurkhas were ordered to withdraw. They came down the slopes as they had gone up, silently, in darkness, carrying their wounded and the bodies of their fallen comrades. They had not taken the monastery, nor had they broken the Gustav line, but their stand on Hangman's Hill became one of the most enduring episodes of the entire Cassino campaign. It was proof that even in the face of impossible odds, courage could carve a place in history as enduring as any victory. The Gurkhas' ordeal at Hangman's Hill remains a testament not only to their martial skill, but to their resilience, loyalty, and indomitable spirit. They fought not for the ridge itself, but for the honour of their regiment and the belief that no Gurkha ever yields ground easily. Long after the guns fell silent, veterans of Cassino remembered the small band of men who held a barren spur of rock within sight of the monastery towers and turned it into a legend of endurance. By the time February turned to March 1944, the Battle of Monte Cassino had become a grim cycle of repetition, frustration, and loss. Allied commanders had hoped that each successive offensive would break the Gustav line, allowing their armies to pour through the Liri Valley toward Rome. Instead, the ground remained locked in stalemate, the shattered ruins of Cassino and its monastery standing as a monument to both human endurance and military miscalculation. The early failures were not merely the result of bad luck, they revealed deeper issues: flawed planning, underestimation of the enemy, and an almost reckless refusal to absorb the hard lessons already written in blood. The first and most glaring error was the Allies' repeated miscalculation of the terrain. The mountains around Cassino were not simply obstacles, they were fortresses. Every ridge, ravine and slope had been studied and fortified by German engineers under General Fridolin von Senger and Etterlin. The paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, veterans hardened in battle, occupied these heights with near-perfect fields of fire. From their vantage points, they could direct artillery onto every Allied approach, turning valleys into killing grounds and ridgelines into walls of flame. To Allied planners, the terrain often looked conquerable on a map. To the soldiers on the ground, it was a labyrinth of stone, mud, and death. Another lesson ignored was the futility of frontal assaults against such defences. Time and again, Allied troops were ordered to advance directly into fortified positions. At Rapido River, American infantry had been slaughtered in waves, their pontoons shredded by machine guns before they could even establish a bridgehead. At Cassino Town, British and Indian troops found themselves fighting through rubble that served only to strengthen German positions. Every building became a pillbox, every collapsed wall a barricade, and every street a trap. Even after the monastery was reduced to rubble by bombing, the destruction provided the Germans with even more cover, ironically improving their defensive advantage. Yet, despite these experiences, the pattern was repeated, as though sheer determination could overcome entrenched tactical flaws. The Allied command structure also bore responsibility. The multinational nature of the force, American, British, Indian, New Zealand, French, Polish, was a symbol of unity, but also a source of strain. Communication breakdowns, differing doctrines, and conflicting priorities meant that coordination was often clumsy. General Mark Clark of the US Fifth Army clashed in outlook with British commanders, while General Bernard Freyberg, leading the New Zealand Corps, distrusted higher-level decisions and pressed for solutions of his own. These divisions at the top filtered down to the battlefield, where soldiers paid with their lives for lack of unified strategy. Meanwhile, the Germans excelled in exploiting every Allied mistake. General Kesselring's defensive doctrine emphasized flexibility: hold key points with elite troops, counterattack with precision, and bleed the enemy until their will faltered. The Fallschirmjäger at Cassino embodied this doctrine perfectly. They used camouflage and deception to survive bombardments, emerging afterward to reoccupy firing positions as if untouched. They constructed interlocking kill zones so that advancing Allied troops faced not just one line of fire, but overlapping arcs from multiple angles. And they refused to be dislodged by anything short of annihilation. Even when cut off, small groups of paratroopers fought on, forcing attackers to expend days and lives for a few yards of rubble. Perhaps the most tragic lesson unlearned was that of attrition. By March, it was clear that the battle was consuming men and material at a rate unsustainable for long-term success. Yet Allied leaders remained committed to the idea that another push, another concentrated effort would be the breakthrough. Soldiers rotated into the front lines already knew the grim truth. Every attack seemed to end the same way, with companies reduced to half their strength, objectives barely gained, and the enemy as firmly entrenched as ever. Cassino had become not just a battle of movement, but a grinding war of endurance, one where the Germans dictated the pace and the Allies absorbed the losses. The stalemate at Cassino was not inevitable. It was manufactured through errors repeated and insights ignored. Terrain was underestimated, enemy skill undervalued, and coordination mismanaged. Each failed assault should have been a warning, a guide to adaptation. Instead, the Allies pressed on with near-identical strategies, as if brute force could achieve what intelligence and maneuver could not. The men in the trenches and rubble learned these lessons bitterly with every passing day. The commanders, however, would take far longer to adjust, time that would cost thousands of lives before the monastery finally fell. While the battles raging around Monte Cassino consumed the attention of generals, soldiers, and civilians in Italy, the struggle for the monastery and the WWII was not an isolated contest. It was part of a vast, interconnected war in which events on one front rippled across oceans and continents, shaping decisions elsewhere. Cassino's stalemate was more than a local frustration. It was a pivot point whose outcome influenced the course of the entire Second World War, stretching from the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruins of Stalingrad and the jungles of the Pacific. To the Western Allies, Cassino was inextricably tied to the looming invasion of France, Operation Overlord. By early 1944, planners in London and Washington were building the most ambitious amphibious operation in history. Yet for that invasion to succeed, it was crucial to keep German divisions pinned down in Italy. If the Allies broke through at Cassino, they could threaten Rome, force Kesselring to commit reserves, and prevent those elite formations from being shifted north to France. Conversely, every delay at Cassino increased the danger that when the beaches of Normandy were stormed, the Wehrmacht would be waiting with reinforced divisions drawn from Italy. Thus, Cassino was not only about capturing Rome, it was about shaping the battlefield of France before a single Allied soldier waded ashore at Omaha or Juno. At the same time, Monte Cassino was watched closely from Moscow. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the German war machine since 1941, and Stalin had long demanded a second front in the West to relieve pressure on the Red Army. To the Soviet leader, the Italian campaign was meant to be proof of Allied commitment. Yet as the Gustav line held month after month, Stalin's frustration deepened. The bloody stalemate at Cassino, combined with the slow Allied advance up the peninsula, seemed to confirm his suspicion that Britain and America were reluctant to challenge Germany directly. As the Soviets fought their titanic battles at Leningrad, Kiev and Kursk, they viewed Cassino as a test of Allied resolve, a test that appeared in those grim early months of 1944 to be failing. In Germany, the impact of Cassino was felt in Hitler's war councils. For the Führer, holding Italy was less about the peninsula itself than about buying time. Every Allied soldier bogged down at Cassino was a soldier not pressing into northern Europe. Every delay in Italy postponed the day when German forces would be caught in a two-front vice. The German propaganda machine trumpeted the monastery as proof of German invincibility, portraying it as a new Thermopylae where outnumbered defenders held off vast Allied armies. The longer Cassino stood unbroken, the more it bolstered German morale and stiffened resistance across occupied Europe. But the echoes of Monte Cassino reached even farther, to the Pacific. In early 1944, American and Australian forces were locked in a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan, advancing through the Solomons, New Guinea, and toward the Marianas. For them, Italy was a reminder of the global scale of the struggle, evidence that victory would require grinding battles of attrition in multiple theatres. Resources, too, were stretched thin. Landing craft, heavy bombers, and shipping were allocated between Europe and the Pacific, with Cassino influencing the calculus. A protracted battle in Italy meant longer commitments of divisions and equipment that might otherwise have been shifted eastward. Every decision made at Monte Cassino reverberated thousands of miles away, where Marines stormed atolls under withering fire in the Pacific. Cassino also underscored the multinational nature of the Allied coalition. Indian divisions fought alongside British regiments, New Zealanders marched beside Poles, French colonial troops climbed mountain passes, while Americans crossed rivers. The world had truly come together at this crossroads of Europe, with soldiers from every corner of the globe converging on a single battlefield. This mirrored the global war itself. Britons and Canadians preparing for Normandy, Soviets driving westward toward Berlin, Chinese resisting Japanese invasion, and Americans engaged across two oceans. In Cassino's smoke-filled ruins, one could see the wider truth of World War II. No front was isolated, no battle fought in isolation. In this sense, Monte Cassino became a microcosm of the war's complexity. It was a clash of strategy, ideology, and endurance that mattered far beyond its immediate ground. Its outcome would decide not only the liberation of Italy, but also the timing and strength of the great offensives in France and the East. For the men who fought and died there, Cassino may have seemed like a brutal, confined struggle over a monastery and a valley. But in reality, their sacrifice rippled across continents, shaping the fate of campaigns they would never see, and contributing to the ultimate course of the most global conflict in human history. In the shadow of Monte Cassino, where the mountains rise like jagged teeth against the Italian sky, men from thousands of miles away fought and bled on soil that was not their own. Among them were the soldiers of the Indian Army, Punjabi Sikhs, Muslim Rajputs, Gurkhas from the Himalayas, and men from Bengal, the Deccan, and the deserts of Rajasthan. They were part of the British Eighth Army, deployed in strength to Italy after having already fought through the brutal North African campaign. At Cassino, they became a cornerstone of the Allied offensive, yet despite their immense contribution, their story has too often been overlooked in the larger Western narratives of the war. The Indian divisions sent to Cassino represented a mosaic of cultures, languages, and religions, each unit carrying its own proud martial traditions. The 4th and 8th Indian Divisions, in particular, were thrown directly into the maelstrom. These were not inexperienced troops. Many had fought Rommel's Afrika Korps in the deserts and endured long campaigns across North Africa and the Middle East. But Cassino was different. This was no sweeping desert war of movement and maneuver. This was a slugging match in mountains, rivers, and ruins, where every stone wall and every gully was a potential death trap. The terrain punished them mercilessly. Indian troops were ordered to climb steep slopes under the cover of night, burdened with heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition, scaling cliffs where even goats struggled to find footing. In the darkness, they navigated minefields and razor wire, all the while knowing that German Fallschirmjäger above them had the advantage of elevation, prepared with machine gun nests, mortars, and snipers. The men moved silently, praying not to trigger an explosion beneath their boots, whispering words of faith in Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, and Nepali. The slopes of Cassino became a proving ground of endurance and courage, testing them beyond human limits. One of the most haunting episodes came during the February offensives, when Indian troops were ordered to attack across snow-covered ridges in freezing rain. Accustomed to the heat of the subcontinent, many of these men had never before experienced winter conditions so harsh. Without proper clothing or supplies, they dug into shallow foxholes on exposed hillsides, where icy winds cut through their uniforms like knives. Some froze to death during the night, their rifles still clutched tightly to their chests. Yet at dawn, those who remained alive rose and pressed forward, hurling themselves once more at fortified German positions. The Indian divisions fought with a mix of grim determination and almost unbreakable spirit. At one point, Sikh regiments advanced up the slopes under a storm of artillery fire, chanting prayers as they climbed, their turbans visible against the white snow. Gurkhas, famed for their ferocity, attempted to infiltrate German lines with their curved kukuri knives, crawling through mud and rubble to surprise entrenched machine gunners. Muslim Rajputs and Punjabi Muslims stood shoulder to shoulder with Hindu Dogras and Marathas, united in the shared agony of battle and in the common bond of soldiering. It was an army that defied easy categorization, drawn from a subcontinent of immense diversity, fighting as one under a foreign flag, yet with a sense of honor that transcended empire. The human cost was staggering. Casualties among the Indian units were devastating, with entire companies being wiped out in futile assaults against impregnable positions. For every hill gained, they often lost it again under the weight of German counterattacks. And yet they returned time and again, hurling themselves into battles that others could not or would not win. Allied commanders came to rely on their toughness, often assigning them some of the most impossible missions, knowing that these men would fight until the last bullet was fired. For the civilians of Cassino and the surrounding valleys, the sight of Indian troops was both a surprise and a revelation. Many Italians had never before seen men from South Asia. They watched in awe as Sikhs with flowing beards and turbans carried supplies through mountain passes, or Gurkhas scaled ridges with the agility of mountain goats. For the weary Italian peasants, these soldiers became both a curiosity and a symbol of how far-reaching the war had become, proof that Cassino was not just an Italian or European struggle, but a global one. And yet, when the war ended, their stories were largely buried beneath the triumphal headlines of Western armies. The contributions of Indian divisions at Cassino, and indeed across the Italian campaign, rarely found their way into the history books of Europe or America. These men returned home, many of them to a country already on the path to independence, where their sacrifices were quickly consumed by the politics of partition and the struggles of a new nation. But at Monte Cassino, their legacy remains carved into the soil. The Indian War Cemetery, located at the foot of the mountain, holds row upon row of graves, each marked with the name of a man who travelled across continents to fight and die in a foreign war. The epitaphs etched in stone speak of loyalty, duty, and sacrifice. They are reminders that the battle for Cassino was not fought by one nation alone, but by an alliance of peoples drawn from every corner of the globe. To remember Monte Cassino without the Indian soldiers is to tell only half the story. Their courage under impossible conditions, their willingness to endure hunger, frost, and unrelenting fire, and their unity across religious and cultural divides stand as a testament to the overlooked diversity of the Allied war effort. They were not just footnotes in history, they were the backbone of the struggle, and their forgotten voices echo still in the ruins of Cassino, whispering of duty, sacrifice, and an unyielding spirit that refused to be broken. When the second phase of the Battle of Monte Cassino unfolded in February 1944, the burden of attack fell heavily upon the men of the 2nd New Zealand Division, commanded by the indomitable yet often controversial Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg. These were soldiers drawn from farms, towns and schools half a world away, men who had first tasted war in Greece, Crete and North Africa. They had earned a reputation for endurance and courage under fire, their names spoken with respect by both friend and foe. Yet at Cassino, their bravery would be tested to breaking point, as they were ordered to hurl themselves again and again against an enemy entrenched in what had become the most formidable fortress in Europe. The New Zealanders entered the battle already carrying the scars of years of relentless campaigning. They had fought through the sands of the Western Desert, had survived the disaster of Greece, and had earned glory at El Alamein. But Cassino was unlike anything they had encountered before. The town itself was a ruin, a jumble of broken walls, shattered churches and collapsed buildings ground into dust by weeks of shelling and bombing. Every heap of rubble concealed German snipers, every crater hid machine guns. The streets had become death traps where movement invited fire from above, and where progress was measured in meters won at terrible cost. Freyberg, who bore the heavy responsibility of command, was a man revered by his troops for his personal courage, yet criticized by many historians for his decisions at Cassino. He pressed for the bombing of the monastery, convinced it was a German stronghold, and after its destruction, he demanded that his New Zealanders and their supporting Indian troops push forward into the ruins of the town. The plan was simple on paper: capture Cassino, seize the monastery, and open the road to Rome. But simplicity was a cruel illusion. On the ground, the Germans, led by the elite Fallschirmjäger, transformed the debris into a labyrinth of interlocking fields of fire. The attacks of February and March became scenes of unparalleled carnage. Night after night, New Zealand infantry advanced under cover of artillery barrages, slipping through smoke and darkness, only to find their progress checked by invisible walls of machine gun fire and sudden mortar strikes. Tanks brought forward to support the infantry found themselves bogged in the ruins, unable to maneuver among the craters and rubble. Many were destroyed outright, their hulks left smouldering in the streets, grim markers of failed assaults. Soldiers often spoke of the strange silence that followed a bombardment, broken suddenly by the crack of German rifles from windows, cellars, and piles of stone where paratroopers seemed to rise from the earth itself. The fighting was so brutal, so intimate, that the New Zealanders described Cassino as the hardest yard of ground in Italy. Men crept forward with bayonets fixed, grenades in hand, fighting house by house, sometimes floor by floor, against enemies who would not yield. Progress was often no more than the capture of a single ruined building, held at dawn at the cost of dozens of lives. And yet, despite this bravery, the pattern repeated itself: attack, advance, counterattack, retreat. Each effort cost hundreds of casualties, with little gained but more rubble stained with blood. The strain on morale was immense. Letters written home by New Zealand soldiers, censored though they were, still carried undertones of despair and frustration. Many felt they had been asked to accomplish the impossible. The men spoke of rain and mud that soaked their greatcoats, of sleepless nights in ruined cellars, of the unending thunder of shells that shook the very earth. Some cursed their commanders, others cursed the war itself, but still they fought on, driven by loyalty to their comrades and by the iron discipline of men who had endured too much to turn back. By the end of March, the New Zealand Division had suffered appalling losses. Entire battalions were reduced to fractions of their former strength. Casualty lists grew so long that back in New Zealand, entire towns felt the weight of mourning. For a nation with a small population, the sacrifice at Cassino was staggering. The men had given everything, yet Cassino still stood, the monastery hill still crowned with German defenders, the road to Rome still blocked. The story of the New Zealanders at Cassino is one of valor entwined with frustration. They fought with a ferocity and determination that left even their enemies in awe, yet they were condemned to fight a battle in which the odds were stacked against them from the start. Their sacrifices were not in vain, for each assault weakened the German defenders, and each yard of ground won prepared the way for the final breakthrough. But to the men themselves and to their families waiting at home, Cassino was a bitter memory, a place where courage met futility in the shadow of a shattered monastery. By the spring of 1944, as the battles around Monte Cassino dragged on with no decisive breakthrough, a new force entered the stage, one whose very presence carried layers of history, pain, and defiance. It was the Polish II Corps under General Władysław Anders, a formation unlike any other in the Allied armies. These were soldiers without a country. Their homeland, Poland, had been crushed in 1939 between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Many of the men in Anders' corps had been imprisoned in Siberian labor camps or forced into exile, surviving against impossible odds before finding their way into the ranks of the Allies. To them, Cassino was not merely another battle in a long campaign, it was a proving ground, an opportunity to demonstrate their courage, their right to be counted, and their claim to a future-free Poland. General Anders himself embodied this resilience. Having been a prisoner of the Soviets before being released in 1941, he had led thousands of displaced Poles, men, women and children, on a perilous march from the Soviet Union across Central Asia, through Persia and into the Middle East. From that odyssey emerged the Polish II Corps, a hardened body of men forged by suffering, bound together by loyalty to a cause larger than themselves. When they finally arrived in Italy in 1944, they were not only experienced soldiers, but also a force driven by desperation and a profound sense of duty. For them, Monte Cassino was not a foreign hill, but a symbol. If they could triumph here, the world would be forced to acknowledge Poland's sacrifice and valor. The Polish soldiers who stood beneath the looming ruins of the monastery in May 1944 were fully aware of the enormity of the task before them. They had seen what had happened to the Americans, the British, the Indians, the New Zealanders, and the Gurkhas who had attempted to storm these slopes before them. They knew that the German paratroopers still occupied near impenetrable positions among the shattered walls and ridges. But unlike other formations, the Poles had come with a fierce determination bordering on fatalism. They understood that success would likely demand terrible losses, but they were prepared to pay that price. For them, Cassino was not simply about seizing ground. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving to both allies and enemies that Poland still lived through its sons. The men of Anders' corps were a diverse mosaic. There were former officers of the pre-war Polish army, farmers and miners who had survived exile, and younger recruits who had come of age during the brutal years of displacement. Many carried personal tragedies, families killed in the German occupation, relatives lost in Soviet purges, entire towns erased from maps. The war had stripped them of homes and futures, yet it had also sharpened their sense of identity. On the eve of their first assaults against Monte Cassino, many Polish soldiers knelt to pray. For some, the monastery itself, though held by the enemy, was a sacred place, built centuries before their own nation had even come into being. To fight beneath its broken walls was to step into history itself. As news spread among Allied lines that the Poles would be the next to attempt the assault, reactions were mixed. Some commanders quietly wondered whether these exiled troops could succeed where hardened divisions had failed. Others saw in them a fresh spirit, a determination unbroken by the repeated stalemates of the past months. Within the Polish ranks, however, there was no such hesitation. The soldiers knew they were being given one of the hardest tasks of the entire Italian campaign, yet they welcomed it. For them, Cassino was more than a battlefield. It was a stage upon which their nation could reassert itself to the world. Thus, in May 1944, as the Allied command prepared its final great push against the Gustav line, the Polish II Corps moved into position. Their arrival was marked not by fanfare, but by the quiet resolve of men who had carried the weight of exile and still stood ready to fight. For the Poles, Monte Cassino would become not only their trial by fire, but also their immortal legacy. What they were about to attempt would forever bind their name to one of the fiercest battles of the Second World War, a story of sacrifice and endurance that would echo across generations. By February 1944, the ruins of Monte Cassino had already absorbed 2 full-scale Allied assaults, each breaking like waves against the immovable rocks of the Gustav line. What had been envisioned as a swift breakthrough in the Italian campaign had become instead a slow, grinding contest of attrition. The second battle had ended in a storm of controversy, with the ancient monastery reduced to rubble by Allied bombers and yet still defying capture. Now, as winter rains gave way to icy winds and snow across the Apennines, the third Battle of Cassino was launched, a struggle that would test the endurance of both attacker and defender and reveal the frustrations gnawing at the Allied command. The assault began in mid-February under the direction of the British 8th Army and with New Zealand General Bernard Freyberg leading the ground offensive. The plan was bold yet deceptively simple. Unleash overwhelming aerial bombardment and artillery barrages to pulverize German positions, then send in infantry and armor to sweep through the ruins and seize the high ground. On the morning of February 15th, the ancient Benedictine monastery itself had been leveled, transformed from a spiritual sanctuary into a shattered skeleton of stone and dust. Many Allied soldiers believed that the German defenders had been buried alive under the bombardment, that their lines had at last been broken. But this assumption was tragically mistaken. In truth, the German paratroopers, the elite Fallschirmjäger of the 1st Parachute Division, had not occupied the monastery itself before its destruction. Instead, they had entrenched themselves in the rocky ridges, cellars, and machine gun nests encircling it. The bombing, far from destroying their defences, had gifted them new strongpoints amidst the rubble. Where once there had been clear walls and open approaches, there were now craters, broken masonry, and jagged obstacles, perfect cover for an army of sharpshooters, mortarmen, and machine gunners trained in mountain warfare. The Allies, in levelling Cassino, had unintentionally built the Germans a fortress of ruins. The New Zealanders, supported by Indian divisions, advanced into this nightmare landscape with extraordinary bravery, but at terrible cost. Streets were reduced to twisted metal and heaps of stone. Tanks bogged down in debris or became easy prey for concealed German guns. Infantry squads advancing house by house were met with relentless fire. Each ruined building in Cassino Town became its own fortress. Each cellar a bunker that had to be cleared room by room, grenade by grenade. The Indian troops, many of them Gurkhas and Rajputs, fought tenaciously in the mountains surrounding the monastery, scaling cliffs and ridges under constant sniper fire. They earned respect and admiration for their endurance, but the progress was excruciatingly slow. The weather compounded the misery. February rains turned the valley into a swamp, coating uniforms and weapons in mud. The Rapido River swelled again, drowning men and equipment in its icy waters. Communication lines failed under the weight of artillery barrages, leaving units cut off and exposed. Every gain was measured in yards, every advance bought with blood. The Germans, well supplied and superbly disciplined, exploited every advantage. Their defensive doctrine was built on fluidity. Small groups, shifting from ruin to ruin, never holding still long enough to be pinned down, yet always reappearing to harass, ambush, and counterattack. The Fallschirmjäger earned from their adversaries a grudging respect. One Allied soldier described them simply as men who fought like demons. Frustration mounted in the Allied ranks. Each new push seemed to founder against the same walls of fire. Allied commanders faced growing pressure from London and Washington to break the stalemate in Italy, but on the ground, progress remained agonizingly elusive. General Freyberg himself grew doubtful, questioning whether the assault could succeed at all. Yet to withdraw meant conceding months of effort and acknowledging defeat in a battle that had already consumed thousands of lives. By March, the Third Battle of Cassino had ground itself into exhaustion. Casualties mounted on both sides, but while the Germans could rotate fresh defenders into their fortified positions, the Allied attackers bled and faltered. Soldiers spoke bitterly of the mountain that eats men. For the Allied troops, Cassino became not just a battlefield, but a psychological torment, a place where courage seemed to vanish into smoke and stone, where every sacrifice yielded almost nothing in return. As the battle petered out, the ruins of Monte Cassino stood unchanged, still crowned by the shattered monastery and still firmly in German hands. The Allies had thrown their strength against it yet again, and once more the defenders had refused to yield. The third battle closed not with triumph, but with a grim acknowledgement of failure. What had been envisioned as a quick thrust toward Rome had devolved into a morass of attritional warfare, and Allied soldiers left the field, knowing that a fourth attempt would inevitably be required. Monte Cassino, by the end of March 1944, had become something more than a strategic obstacle. It had become a symbol of German resilience, of Allied frustration, and of a campaign mired in blood and stone. And though the Allies would return, stronger and more determined, the scars of the third battle would remain etched into the memories of all who fought there. The bombing of Monte Cassino Abbey had been intended as a decisive blow, a thunderous act meant to sweep away the heart of German resistance and allow the Allies to finally break through the Gustav line. Instead, it had the opposite effect, transforming the shattered monastery into one of the most formidable fortresses of the Second World War. What had once been an open, sprawling complex of prayer halls, libraries, courtyards and cloisters was now reduced to jagged heaps of stone, collapsed walls and broken arches. But in this chaos, the German defenders saw opportunity. The Fallschirmjäger, already renowned for their cunning and skill, immediately recognized that the ruins offered them natural cover. Each pile of rubble became a barricade. Each collapsed archway became a firing slit. Each shattered staircase, now mangled and broken, became a perfect choke point to stall enemy infantry. What had been a sacred space for centuries was reborn as a fortress of war, and its desecration now gave the defenders an unparalleled advantage. The irony was stark and bitter. Before the bombing, the Germans had respected the Vatican's neutrality and refrained from occupying the Abbey itself, positioning their troops around its slopes rather than within its walls. After the bombardment, with the Abbey in ruins, they moved in swiftly and decisively, weaving themselves into the debris like phantoms of stone and dust. Machine gun nests were carved out of collapsed chapels, mortar positions were hidden under beams and rubble, and snipers took up positions in the fractured skeleton of what had once been the Great Dome. The broken Abbey, instead of lying silent, now echoed with the crack of rifles and the roar of artillery. Every attempt by Allied forces to advance toward the summit found itself ensnared in a labyrinth of wreckage, where visibility was poor, lines of fire were perfect, and every step forward invited ambush. For the attacking soldiers, the monastery ruins became a nightmare landscape. Advancing infantry had to scramble over broken masonry while under constant fire, their helmets ringing with the whine of bullets ricocheting off stone. Tanks and armoured vehicles, so vital in modern warfare, were useless in the broken terrain. Their treads could not navigate the jagged slopes, and artillery fire from the Germans ensured that no armoured column could approach safely. The ruins turned warfare back into something primeval, hand-to-hand fighting, bayonet charges in the dust, grenades tossed blindly into dark cavities where hidden enemies might lurk. The Allies, who had hoped the Abbey's destruction would open the way, now found themselves trapped in a hellish struggle, facing a fortress stronger than any architect could have designed. Beyond the tactical implications, the ruins of Monte Cassino carried a heavy psychological weight. To the Germans, they became a symbol of defiance, proof that even the most sacred and ancient structures could be turned into tools of resistance. To the Allies, they were a constant reminder of their own mistake, a strategic blunder that had not only failed to weaken the enemy, but had also destroyed one of Europe's greatest cultural treasures. Soldiers advancing under fire could not help but notice the broken fragments of statues, frescoes, and ancient stones crushed underfoot as they fought, a tragic juxtaposition of history and carnage. The moral burden hung in the air as heavily as the smoke, and commanders knew that every day the Germans held the ruins, Allied credibility suffered in the eyes of the world. The transformation of the Abbey into a fortress also reinforced the wider truth of Monte Cassino, that this battlefield was unlike any other. Here, history, faith, and strategy collided in brutal fashion. The ruins symbolized not just military resilience, but the stubbornness of a conflict where neither side would yield. The Allies hurled themselves again and again against the stone skeleton of the monastery, and the Germans, dug in among its fallen walls, seemed to draw strength from the destruction itself. What had once been a beacon of knowledge and spiritual endurance was now a symbol of modern war's darkest irony, the destruction of culture creating the strongest of defenses. Monte Cassino's ruins became a fortress not by design, but by consequence. In trying to break the German hold, the Allies had instead gifted them a redoubt of unimaginable strength, and so the Abbey, shattered but unbowed, became the stage for some of the most desperate fighting of the campaign, its broken stones bearing silent witness as men killed and died among the relics of centuries. It was a tragedy layered upon tragedy, and its legacy would echo long after the guns finally fell silent. The Battle of Monte Cassino was not only a clash of armies, but also a crucible of human suffering, where the cost of each advance or retreat was measured not just in territory gained, but in blood, shattered bodies, and broken spirits. Behind every statistic of dead and wounded lay a grim reality, one that unfolded in trenches, field hospitals, and makeshift evacuation routes under fire. The steep slopes of the Liri Valley and the rocky terrain surrounding the Abbey became killing grounds where soldiers fell in their hundreds each day. For the survivors, the ordeal did not end with the shrapnel wound or the bullet strike. The struggle continued in the agonizing hours that followed, as medics scrambled to save lives in conditions that seemed designed to deny them. The mountains of Monte Cassino were merciless, and so too was the toll exacted on human flesh. On the front lines, the first lifeline for the wounded was the field medic, those unarmed soldiers who carried satchels of bandages, morphine syrettes, and little else but courage. Under the hiss of machine gun fire and the shriek of artillery, medics crawled through mud and rubble to reach men who were crying out for help, or lying in silence. The work was relentless and harrowing. A severed artery had to be clamped with bare hands. Shattered limbs were bound with improvised splints. Sucking chest wounds were sealed with whatever cloth could be found. Morphine eased some of the agony, but supplies often ran short, leaving many to endure unthinkable pain while waiting to be carried back. The medics became symbols of hope amid horror, risking their own lives repeatedly to preserve those of others. Yet they, too, carried the scars of what they witnessed, their minds branded with the memory of faces they could not save. Evacuation was its own nightmare. The geography of Cassino turned every attempt to move the wounded into a deadly gamble. Narrow mule tracks and steep inclines forced stretcher bearers to carry men on their shoulders through mud, stone, and gunfire. Vehicles could rarely reach the forward positions, and even when ambulances were available, they were prime targets for artillery barrages. Many soldiers bled to death waiting for transport, their comrades helpless to quicken the journey. Those who survived the trek often endured hours of agony before reaching the safety of a field dressing station, where overworked doctors and nurses fought to keep them alive. The air in those makeshift facilities was thick with the smell of blood, iodine, and burnt flesh from cauterized wounds. Canvas tents and requisitioned farmhouses overflowed with casualties, the groans of the dying mixing with the shouted orders of medical staff working far beyond the limits of endurance. In the field hospitals farther to the rear, the scale of suffering became even more visible. Long rows of stretchers lined every corridor, men with bandaged heads, missing limbs and haunted eyes staring into the void. Surgeons operated in near-constant shifts, their aprons soaked in blood, their instruments sterilized quickly over boiling water between cases. Amputations were heartbreakingly common. For many, it was the only way to prevent infection from spreading beyond control. Penicillin was still scarce and jealously rationed, leaving many dependent on older, less effective treatments. The soundscape of the hospitals was one of moans, whispered prayers and sometimes screams as operations were performed with insufficient anesthesia. Yet, amid this anguish, there were also moments of triumph. Lives saved against impossible odds, men brought back from the brink by skill, luck, and determination. The psychological wounds were as deep as the physical. Soldiers who returned from the slopes of Cassino often carried nightmares that no surgeon could excise. The trauma of seeing comrades blown apart, of waiting helplessly for evacuation under fire, of staring at ruined bodies in overcrowded wards left invisible scars that shaped them long after the battle. For the medical personnel, the toll was equally brutal. Nurses who wiped the brows of dying men, chaplains who whispered last rites, and stretcher-bearers who carried countless broken bodies, all lived with the weight of what they had witnessed. In a battle defined by strategy, terrain, and destruction, the human cost stood as the most unrelenting truth. No victory could erase the rivers of suffering that flowed through its hospitals and trenches alike. Monte Cassino was, above all, a test of endurance, not only for armies but for the fragile human body and spirit. Each hill won or lost was paid for in amputated limbs, shattered lungs, and lifelong trauma. The medics and surgeons, though unsung in the headlines, became quiet heroes of the campaign, standing in defiance of despair with their bandages and scalpels. Yet even their efforts could not disguise the scale of sacrifice. By the end of the battle, tens of thousands lay dead or wounded, their suffering etched into the collective memory of nations. Cassino would be remembered as a victory of sorts, but one so drenched in pain that the triumph seemed hollow. It was, in the most brutal sense, a monument to the human cost of war. The Battle of Monte Cassino was not only a contest of guns, tanks, and artillery, but a brutal test of human endurance, of mind, spirit, and will. By the time the fighting dragged into its third and fourth months, the soldiers on both sides found themselves ground down by the relentless pressure of mountain warfare. Sleep was a luxury, meals were uncertain, and death was never far away. The human body and mind have limits, and at Cassino those limits were pushed to the breaking point. For the Allies, morale became a precarious balancing act. Units rotated in and out of the line, yet the respite was often so brief that exhaustion still clung to men like a second skin. Soldiers were ordered to climb steep ravines at night, burdened with packs and weapons, only to find themselves pinned down at dawn in rocky craters under the merciless hammering of German mortars. Men would go days without proper rest, huddled in makeshift foxholes that collapsed under rain or froze in the mountain chill. In letters home, many wrote of a strange numbness, a feeling of fighting not for victory, but simply to survive until the next morning. On the German side, the psychological strain was no less severe. Though their defensive positions gave them the advantage, the endless pounding by Allied artillery and the knowledge that they were vastly outnumbered eroded nerves. The paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division earned a reputation for stubborn resistance, but even these hardened veterans grew weary of the ceaseless thunder of bombardment and the never-ending waves of Allied attacks. Supplies had to be carried by mule along treacherous trails, and wounded men often lay for hours before stretcher-bearers could reach them. As one German officer later admitted, "We felt as though we were being buried alive in rubble, day after day." The toll was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Soldiers began to suffer from what was then called battle fatigue, a condition that today would be recognized as combat stress or PTSD. Tremors, stuttering, hallucinations, and sudden uncontrollable weeping were reported among the ranks. For some, the only way to escape the unrelenting pressure was desertion. Among Allied forces, there were cases of soldiers slipping away under cover of darkness, blending into nearby villages or feigning injury to be evacuated. Desertion rates were not astronomical, but they reflected the unbearable weight placed on ordinary men asked to fight in extraordinary conditions. In the German army, desertion was far more dangerous. Orders from the highest levels made it clear any man caught abandoning his post faced execution. Yet even under threat of death, some slipped away. Particularly foreign conscripts pressed into German service or those who had lost faith in the war altogether. For them, the endless siege of Cassino felt like a trap with no escape, except the desperate gamble of flight. Commanders on both sides knew that morale was as vital as ammunition. Religious services were held in the ruins of churches, chaplains moved through the trenches offering comfort, and rumors of imminent breakthroughs were spread to maintain hope. Cigarettes, letters from home, and the rare hot meal became priceless treasures, boosting spirits in ways no amount of orders or speeches could. Yet no sermon or ration could fully mask the exhaustion in men's eyes. The longer the stalemate dragged on, the heavier the sense of futility became. Soldiers began to question the very meaning of the battle. Why sacrifice so much for a mountain monastery and a ruined town? Why bleed endlessly when the front moved only by inches? In whispered conversations among foxholes, men admitted what officers dared not say aloud. Cassino felt like a bottomless pit that swallowed lives without mercy. And yet, remarkably, the armies held. Fatigued, broken and haunted, the men of Cassino continued to fight. For the Allies, the promise of breaking through to Rome remained a flickering light in the distance. For the Germans, the knowledge that they were delaying the inevitable carried its own grim pride. But for the men on the ground, muddy, hungry, sleepless and afraid, morale, fatigue and desertion were not abstractions. They were the daily realities of survival on a battlefield where the human spirit was tested as severely as flesh and bone. By the spring of 1944, the stalemate at Monte Cassino had become intolerable. The Allied armies had bled themselves dry against the Gustav line in 3 failed offensives, and yet the mountains still bristled with German defences. Rome remained tantalizingly out of reach, its liberation delayed by months of bitter fighting. Allied commanders knew that a final, decisive effort was required. Not another piecemeal attack, not another gamble of brute force, but a meticulously coordinated operation that would bring together the full weight of their multinational armies. Out of this necessity, Operation Diadem was born. Planning began in earnest in March, under the leadership of General Sir Harold Alexander, commander of the Allied armies in Italy. Alexander's vision was clear. The Gustav line would be smashed not by frontal assaults alone, but by a carefully synchronized convergence of 4 major armies striking across a wide front. The British 8th Army, under General Oliver Leese, would attack along the Liri Valley, where the flat ground offered the best chance for armour to advance. The US 5th Army, led by General Mark Clark, would strike from the south and west, pressing the Germans from multiple directions. Crucially, these assaults would be coordinated with the French Expeditionary Corps under General Alphonse Juin, whose Moroccan and Algerian troops had already proven their mastery in mountain fighting, and the Polish II Corps under General Władysław Anders, who had been tasked with the daunting mission of seizing the monastery heights themselves. This was not simply another attack on Cassino, it was a campaign designed to break the entire German defensive system in central Italy. Weeks of preparation went into the plan. Engineers built secret roads and bridges under the cover of night, enabling tanks and artillery to be moved into forward positions without alerting the enemy. Dummy camps, false radio traffic, and deceptive troop movements were employed to convince the Germans that the Allies might attempt another direct assault or a coastal landing elsewhere. Supplies were stockpiled in staggering quantities: ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical provisions enough to sustain a prolonged offensive. Every lesson learned from the failures of the past year was folded into this grand design. What made Operation Diadem unique was the scale of coordination. For the first time in Italy, every Allied national contingent would act in unison. Polish soldiers who had marched out of Soviet exile to join the Western Allies prepared for their symbolic strike against Monte Cassino, a fight that carried the weight of their nation's dignity. French colonial troops trained relentlessly in the hills, acclimating themselves to the rugged terrain where their mountain warfare skills would be decisive. Indian divisions, battle-hardened from the previous assaults, drilled for another push through the ravines and ridges. Across the front, soldiers sensed that this was no longer just another battle. It was the moment that would decide the fate of the Italian campaign. The Germans, for their part, were not blind to the coming storm. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, recognized the vulnerabilities of his overstretched defensive lines. Yet, with Hitler's orders to hold Rome at all costs, he could do little but reinforce key strongholds and prepare his men for the inevitable. Still, cracks had begun to appear. The winter had cost the Wehrmacht dearly, and replacements were scarce. Supplies were thinning, morale was fraying, and the sheer weight of Allied manpower and material threatened to overwhelm even the most skillful defences. In the Allied planning rooms, maps of the Liri Valley, Cassino Town, and the surrounding mountains were studied with almost surgical precision. Generals bent over tables, moving markers to indicate divisions, artillery, and armoured columns. trying to anticipate every German countermeasure. Air commanders promised waves of support from the skies, ensuring that when the ground assault began, the Luftwaffe would be pinned down and unable to interfere. Naval forces too stood ready, prepared to shell coastal targets and disrupt any German reinforcements attempting to move north. By early May, the stage was set. Thousands of soldiers waited in the shadows of the mountains, their weapons cleaned, their rations packed, and their nerves taut with expectation. Officers whispered encouragement, chaplains offered prayers, and the rumble of hidden tanks could be heard in the valleys as night convoys moved into final positions. Across the lines, German sentries strained their ears, suspicious but uncertain of when and where the hammer would fall. Operation Diadem was more than just a military plan, it was a gamble of history. If it succeeded, the Gustav line would shatter, Cassino would fall, and Rome would lie open to liberation. If it failed, the Allies risked yet another drawn-out bloodbath, with their soldiers' morale collapsing under the weight of futility. Every soldier who crouched in the dark before dawn on May 11, 1944, knew that they were about to be part of something decisive. The silence before the storm was almost unbearable, and then, as the final hours ticked away, the Allied guns prepared to roar once more, heralding the beginning of the battle that would finally decide the fate of Monte Cassino. By the spring of 1944, as the Allied High Command finalised its designs for Operation Diadem, the planned fourth and decisive assault on Monte Cassino, one of the most striking features of the coming battle, was not only the scale of the forces assembled, but their extraordinary diversity. For the first time in the campaign, the Gustav line would face an assault mounted by a coalition so broad, so global, and so varied in its composition that it seemed to mirror the very idea of a world war. The gathering armies represented not just nations but empires, colonies, and exiled governments in arms, each bringing its own traditions of warfare, motivations for fighting, and cultural backgrounds. Together, they would converge on a single battlefield, the shattered hills and rivers of Cassino, to deliver what was hoped to be the decisive blow that would at last pry open the gates to Rome. The multinational character of the force was staggering. From the north, the British Eighth Army, commanded by General Sir Oliver Leese, drew upon its long experience in the desert campaigns of North Africa. Its ranks included battle-hardened divisions from Britain, alongside the formidable Polish II Corps under General Władysław Anders, men who had escaped Soviet captivity and exile with their families, carrying with them both a burning desire to fight the Germans and the tragic knowledge that their homeland remained under occupation. Beside them marched the Indian divisions of the British Indian Army, Punjabis, Gurkhas, Sikhs, Rajputs, soldiers who fought under the Union Jack but carried with them traditions of courage and martial valour shaped in the plains of the subcontinent and the Himalayas. These men, far from home, now found themselves in Italy's mountains where their endurance and skill in rugged terrain made them indispensable. To the west, the US Fifth Army under General Mark Clark fielded its own multinational composition. While predominantly American, with divisions from across the United States, it was bolstered by the French Expeditionary Corps under General Alphonse Juin. This remarkable force was drawn largely from France's colonial empire, Algerian tirailleurs, Moroccan Goumiers, and Senegalese troops, who brought with them the fierce mountain fighting traditions of North Africa. The Goumiers in particular, skilled in scaling impossible ridges and moving silently through rugged landscapes, would play a critical role in turning the German flanks in the weeks to come. Their very presence on the battlefield reflected both the reach of empire and the reality that victory in Europe was being bought not just with European blood, but with sacrifices from Africa, Asia, and beyond. The scale of this coalition demanded intricate coordination. Allied planners faced the immense task of knitting together forces that spoke different languages, used different equipment, and operated with different doctrines. A British staff officer might share a table with a Polish general, an American colonel, and a French liaison, each representing armies with their own priorities and traditions. Orders often had to be translated multiple times before reaching frontline units, and the logistics of supply had to account for varying needs, from British rations to Indian dietary requirements, from the mule trains favoured by the Goumiers to the heavy motor columns of the Americans. Yet, out of this complexity emerged a powerful sense of shared purpose. The enemy, after all, was common. The Wehrmacht divisions of the Gustav line dug in amidst the rubble of Cassino and determined to hold their ground. This coalition was not without tensions. National pride and rivalry sometimes simmered beneath the surface. The New Zealanders, exhausted from earlier assaults, looked with bitterness upon what they saw as ill-coordinated British planning. The Americans, still smarting from costly failures at Anzio and earlier along the Rapido, were wary of being used as shock troops for British designs. The Poles, fighting under their own command but integrated into the British structure, carried the heavy burden of representing a nation that was absent from the map of Europe. Even within the French Expeditionary Corps, cultural divides between officers of metropolitan France and colonial soldiers were sharp. Yet necessity held the alliance together. None of these armies could hope to break the Gustav line alone. Only by acting in unison could the Allies succeed. Operation Diadem thus became not merely a military campaign, but a striking demonstration of global unity in war. At Cassino, Indian sepoys fought alongside Polish lancers, French mountain troops advanced alongside American infantry, and British artillery rained fire in support of Moroccan skirmishers moving up goat trails. The very hills and valleys around Monte Cassino echoed with commands shouted in dozens of languages, from Arabic to Hindi, from Polish to English. It was a reminder that World War II was not confined to Europe or fought solely by Europeans. The liberation of Italy was being bought with the blood of men from every corner of the world, many of whom would never return to their distant homes. As the spring of 1944 ripened and the final preparations were laid, this vast multinational army stood poised along the line of departure. Behind them lay months of frustration and stalemate, battles fought and lost in mud, snow and blood. Before them loomed the Abbey ruins of Monte Cassino, the symbol of German defiance, and beyond it the road to Rome. The coming assault would test not only the military strength of the Allies, but the very cohesion of their global coalition. Success would hinge on their ability to fight as one, to overcome not just the German defences, but the divisions of culture, language and history. And in that sense, the Battle of Monte Cassino would become a proving ground, not just for soldiers, but for the very idea of Allied unity itself. As spring blossomed in 1944, the Allied High Command prepared to unleash its decisive stroke against the Gustav line, Operation Diadem. Central to this ambitious plan was a force whose presence on the rugged slopes of Italy seemed almost preordained by history, the French Expeditionary Corps, commanded by General Alphonse Juin. Drawn largely from North Africa, its heart and spirit lay in the Moroccan Goumiers, mountain warriors whose reputation for toughness, stealth and endurance stretched back centuries. These were not conventional soldiers in polished boots and pressed uniforms. The Goumiers moved across the battlefield as if it were their ancestral terrain. Wrapped in striped woolen cloaks known as djellabas, their heads often covered by turbans or chechias, they cut figures that seemed more medieval than modern. Yet behind this appearance lay formidable skill. Many had grown up in the harsh landscapes of the Atlas Mountains, where life demanded agility, strength, and an intimate knowledge of terrain. Now, on the mountainous frontiers of Italy, those skills would prove invaluable. Where mechanized divisions bogged down and where tanks could not pass, the Goumiers climbed, carrying their weapons and supplies on their backs or strapped to sure-footed mules. They traversed terrain thought impassable, sheer slopes, crags, and goat trails, moving with a speed and silence that unnerved the German defenders. By night, they advanced under the cover of darkness, often appearing behind enemy positions where no Allied commander had believed men could reach. Their knives, rifles, and sheer ferocity in close combat quickly gave them a reputation that spread along the front lines, whispered in equal parts admiration and fear. General Juin, himself a master strategist and an unconventional thinker, understood precisely how to employ his Goumiers. Where other Allied units struggled to grind forward along the valley floors, Juin unleashed his mountain troops to attack the Gustav line from above, bypassing fortifications and rendering German strongpoints vulnerable from the rear. It was an innovation rooted not in textbooks of modern mechanized warfare, but in the ancient principles of tribal mountain fighting. The results were extraordinary. At Monte Maio and the surrounding peaks, the Goumiers launched daring assaults, climbing under artillery fire and striking where the Germans least expected them. Their victories opened cracks in the Gustav line and paved the way for the Allied push that would culminate in the liberation of Rome. For Dig In and his North African fighters, it was proof that their unique skills were not relics of a bygone era, but decisive factors in modern war. Yet alongside the battlefield heroics came shadows that history cannot ignore. The Goumiers developed a controversial reputation for looting, pillaging, and committing atrocities in villages they passed through, acts that marred their battlefield achievements and left a bitter legacy among Italian civilians. To many of the Allies who fought alongside them, this dual image was hard to reconcile. On the one hand, warriors whose bravery broke the stalemate of Cassino, and on the other, a force accused of brutal excesses. Still, on the slopes of the Apennines, in the valleys where the Gustav line once seemed unbreakable, their contribution was undeniable. Without the French Expeditionary Corps, and particularly the Moroccan Goumiers, the Allied advance may have faltered yet again in the face of German resilience. Their story is one of paradox, of valour and violence, of triumph and controversy, of men shaped by mountains who carved a path through Italy's most formidable heights. The French Expeditionary Corps stands today as both legend and lesson, a reminder that war is fought not only with tanks and planes, but also with human endurance, cultural traditions, and the often troubling complexities of those who wield them. The night of May 11, 1944, descended upon the Liri Valley with an ominous stillness. For months, the Allied armies had prepared for this moment, gathering men, guns, and supplies in secret, masking their intent with careful deception and feints. At precisely 11 p.m., the silence shattered. Along a 20-mile front, more than 1,600 Allied artillery pieces roared to life, their thunder echoing through the valleys and mountains of central Italy. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the bombardment. Shells arced through the darkness in ceaseless waves, slamming into the German fortifications of the Gustav line. For 8 relentless minutes the sky was lit with fire, the night transformed into a hellish daylight of explosions. Entire hillsides shook as bunkers collapsed, barbed wire was shredded, and German communication lines were severed. It was one of the most concentrated artillery barrages of the Italian campaign, meant to stun and overwhelm the defenders before the infantry surged forward. When the guns lifted, the infantry moved. British 8th Army units advanced across the Rapido River, engineers rushing to throw bridges into place under machine gun fire. The Canadians pushed forward along the valley floor, their tanks grinding across the churned earth where every step was contested. To the west, the Americans of the 5th Army pressed toward the Oronchi Mountains, where the terrain itself seemed to conspire with the German defenders. In the darkness, the North African troops of General Juin's French Expeditionary Corps climbed the steep ridges, scaling slopes the enemy had thought impassable. At the centre, the Polish II Corps prepared for its own brutal task, to attack the shattered ruins of Monte Cassino, the monastery that loomed as both symbol and fortress of German resistance. The German defence, though battered, did not break. Veteran troops of the 1st Parachute Division and other hardened units emerged from their bunkers, dazed but alive, and quickly returned fire. Their machine guns raked the advancing Allied infantry, and their mortars plunged into the river crossings, turning makeshift bridges into flaming wreckage. Time and again, the Allies hurled themselves forward, only to be driven back by withering fire. The Gustav line, even after months of bombardment and the full weight of Allied strength, still held teeth of steel. But this time, unlike the 3 earlier battles of Cassino, the Allies pressed on with a unified plan coordinated across national armies. The French in the mountains outflanked German strongholds, creating pressure on their right flank. The British and Canadians forced crossings under unimaginable strain, inching bridgeheads across the Rapido. And the Poles, fighting with grim determination, launched wave after wave of uphill assaults, clawing their way toward the Abbey through rubble, minefields, and nests of machine guns. The fighting was ferocious and unrelenting. Whole companies vanished in minutes. Hills and ridges changed hands multiple times in a single night. Smoke from artillery, dust from shattered stone, and the cries of wounded men mingled into a chaos that stretched across the valley. And yet, slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. German units that had repelled every attack for months now faced pressure from every direction. Their reserves stretched thin, their supply lines harassed, their soldiers exhausted by the ceaseless barrage. By the second day, May 12th, the scale of the assault revealed itself. This was no probing attack, no diversion, but a concerted strike by an entire multinational force determined to smash the Gustav line once and for all. For the Germans, every hill lost meant the threat of encirclement. Every Allied foothold meant another step toward Rome. The Fourth Battle of Cassino had begun in fire and fury, and unlike the failed attempts before, this time the Allies would not let go. For the Polish II Corps, the assault on Monte Cassino was more than a military operation. It was a matter of national identity, honor, and vengeance. These men were not fighting merely for the liberation of Italy. They were exiles, soldiers without a homeland, their own country crushed beneath both Nazi and Soviet boots. Many of them had endured Soviet gulags, deportations, and years of displacement before finally reaching Allied ranks. Under the command of General Władysław Anders, they carried into battle not only rifles and bayonets, but also the weight of a nation denied its freedom. When they were given the task of storming the monastery ruins atop Monte Cassino, they accepted with grim determination, knowing the cost would be terrible, but also knowing that their sacrifice might etch Poland's name forever into the annals of history. On May the 12th, 1944, as the Fourth Battle of Cassino raged, Anders's men launched their initial attacks against the German positions on the slopes leading to the Abbey. They faced the seasoned warriors of the German 1st Parachute Division, men who had turned the shattered hills into a fortress. Every ridge bristled with machine guns, every path was mined, and every boulder concealed a sniper's nest. The Poles advanced through a storm of fire, climbing steep, rocky ground that was open and exposed to German observation. Shells burst among them, throwing bodies into the air, while mortar rounds pounded the narrow gullies where they sought shelter. The advance was slow, bloody, and relentless. Units became separated in the smoke and dust, and entire companies were cut down in minutes. Still, they pressed forward, their rallying cry echoing across the battlefield. Za wolność naszą I waszą, for our freedom and yours. The fighting over the following days was a brutal test of endurance. The Poles attacked by night and by day, inching closer to the ruins of the Abbey, only to be driven back again and again. The slopes of Monte Cassino were littered with bodies, men sprawled in unnatural stillness where they had fallen. Wounded soldiers crawled back down the rocky terrain, their uniforms torn and bloodied, while fresh battalions moved upward to take their place. Supply lines had to be carved through the chaos, ammunition carried by hand up steep trails under constant fire. Communication was nearly impossible, and yet the will of the Polish soldiers remained unbroken. They had sworn to plant their flag on the monastery, no matter the cost. By May 17th, after days of ferocious combat, the Germans finally began to yield. They had fought with incredible skill and tenacity, but their lines were stretched too thin, their defences battered from every side by the Allied onslaught. That morning, Anders ordered one final push. Exhausted and bloodied, the Poles advanced yet again, fighting hand to hand among the rubble and ruins. Grenades cleared bunkers, bayonets flashed in close combat, and slowly the Germans withdrew, leaving behind the shattered monastery that had become the symbol of their defiance. On May 18th, as the sun rose over the smouldering battlefield, a patrol from the 12th Podolian Uhlans clambered up the final slope and entered the Abbey grounds. There, in the ruins of the once majestic Benedictine monastery, they raised the red and white flag of Poland. It fluttered against the morning sky, a vivid symbol of triumph purchased at a terrible price. Below, the valley echoed with the sound of bagpipes from a Scottish regiment saluting their allies, and across the Allied lines word spread. Monte Cassino had finally fallen. For the Polish II Corps, the victory was bittersweet. Out of the 50,000 men who had taken part in the battle, nearly 4,000 were killed, wounded, or missing. The cemetery at the foot of Monte Cassino would soon be filled with row upon row of white crosses, each marking the grave of a soldier who would never see his homeland again. And tragically, for many of those who survived, Poland itself would remain beyond reach. Swallowed into the Soviet sphere of influence at the war's end, Yet in that moment, atop the ruins of Monte Cassino, they had achieved something immortal. Their courage and sacrifice had broken the strongest German defences in Italy and opened the road to Rome. Monte Cassino was no longer just a battlefield. For the Poles, it was sacred ground, a monument to their resilience and proof that even a nation in chains could still fight, bleed, and triumph for the cause of freedom. The morning of May 18, 1944, dawned heavy with smoke, dust, and silence, an unfamiliar silence after months of relentless thunder from artillery and mortars. The slopes of Monte Cassino, scarred by craters and strewn with shattered stone, lay eerily still. For the first time in weeks, the hilltop monastery was no longer spewing fire upon the Allied lines. The German paratroopers, who had defended it with almost superhuman tenacity, had finally withdrawn during the night, leaving behind a mountain turned into a cemetery. For the Polish II Corps, who had clawed their way up the rock and ruin under withering fire, this was the moment they had bled for. A moment that carried the weight of their lost homeland, their exiled families, and the thousands of comrades who now lay buried in the valley below. As dawn broke, a patrol from the 12th Podolian Uhlands Regiment carefully ascended the final slopes toward the monastery. Every step was taken with caution. Even in retreat, the Germans had left behind booby traps, snipers, and the ever-present threat of sudden ambush. The ruined monastery walls loomed above them, great blocks of stone shattered by Allied bombardments, archways collapsed into heaps of rubble, frescoes blackened by fire. Once a beacon of faith and peace, the Benedictine Abbey now resembled the skeletal remains of a civilization crushed beneath war's iron heel. The soldiers moved quietly among the ruins, their boots crunching over fragments of sacred marble and splintered pews. Then, in the pale morning light, came the defining gesture. From among the rubble, a Polish soldier unfurled the red and white banner of his nation. Torn from exile, forbidden from flying over their own occupied homeland, this flag was not merely cloth, it was the embodiment of Poland itself. Slowly, carefully, the men raised it high over the battered stones of Monte Cassino. And there it flew, stark against the smoke-stained sky, its colours vivid against the grey ruins. For the Poles, it was a moment beyond victory. It was resurrection. The scene was almost biblical in its symbolism. Below, across the Liri Valley, Allied troops paused to watch. The scarlet and white banner waved defiantly in the wind, signalling to all who could see. Monte Cassino had fallen. Scottish bagpipes played in salute, their haunting notes drifting across the battlefield. British, French, and Indian soldiers raised their eyes in acknowledgement, knowing that the Poles had achieved what so many before them could not. Months of stalemate, of bloodshed and sacrifice had ended with that simple yet powerful act of defiance, the raising of a flag. But behind the triumph lay sorrow. Thousands of Polish soldiers who had fought for this moment would never see it. They lay in shallow graves on the slopes they had stormed, their lifeblood poured into foreign soil. And cruelly, for those who lived, the victory was tinged with tragedy. Their homeland, Poland, was still in chains, carved up by agreements made in distant rooms, its freedom bartered between great powers. The flag flew proudly over Monte Cassino, yet it could not fly freely over Warsaw, Krakow, or Lwów. The irony was as sharp as the triumph was glorious. Still, in that moment, none of this mattered. The Polish flag fluttered in the Italian wind, a beacon of courage, sacrifice, and indomitable spirit. For the Allied armies, it marked the breach of the Gustav line and the path to Rome. For the Poles, it was something deeper, proof that though their homeland had been stolen, their spirit could never be extinguished. The ruins of the Abbey, silent witnesses to centuries of history, now bore witness to one more chapter. Where monks had once prayed, soldiers now stood in exhausted reverence. Where hymns had once echoed, the wind carried the flapping of a flag raised in defiance of tyranny. And though time would move on, though the war would shift to other fields and other battles, the image of the Polish flag over Monte Cassino would remain etched forever into the memory of World War II, a moment of victory, grief, and eternal honour. The fall of Monte Cassino was not merely the capture of a ruined abbey, it was the collapse of a fortress that had pinned down the Allies for half a year. For 4 bloody battles, the Gustav line had stood unbroken, a bastion of German engineering and determination. Now, at last, it had cracked. Yet the Wehrmacht did not disintegrate. True to their reputation, the Germans withdrew not in panic, but in grim, methodical order, fighting for every step, delaying the Allied advance even as their most formidable position slipped from their grasp. As the Polish flag fluttered above the shattered monastery, German paratroopers and infantry units, those who had not been annihilated or captured, were already melting away under cover of darkness. Their retreat was a feat of discipline. Engineers blew bridges behind them, mined crossroads, and felled trees across narrow roads to stall the pursuing tanks. Rearguard detachments fought with bitter tenacity, laying down bursts of machine gun fire, launching ambushes from ruined farmhouses, then disappearing before encirclement could crush them. For every mile the Allies advanced, German troops exacted a toll in blood and time. The terrain itself aided the withdrawal. The Liri Valley, though open compared to the forbidding slopes of Cassino, was still broken by streams, hedgerows and villages that could be turned into miniature fortresses. German artillery, positioned with precision, unleashed sudden barrages to halt Allied thrusts. Mortars and snipers delayed infantry patrols at crossroads, forcing them to sweep fields and buildings inch by inch. The road forward may have been opened, but it was no triumphal march. The Allies discovered that breaking the Gustav line did not mean breaking the German army. For the Germans, the withdrawal was a calculated sacrifice. General Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, had long understood that no line, however strong, could hold indefinitely under the weight of Allied manpower, artillery, and air superiority. His aim was never to hold Cassino forever, but to delay, to bleed, and to buy time. With the Allies at last breaking through, his forces fell back toward their next prepared line of defense, the so-called Hitler Line, a new belt of bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles some miles to the north. The Gustav Line had served its purpose. 6 months of grinding delay that had prevented the Allies from storming into Rome during the winter of 1943-44. Now, the battle would shift further up the Italian peninsula. For the Allied soldiers moving forward, the retreating Germans left behind a trail of destruction and sorrow. Villages were burned, bridges destroyed, fields mined. Italian civilians who had endured months of bombardment, hunger and occupation emerged cautiously from cellars and caves. Many wept at the sight of advancing Allied columns, both in relief and in grief. Their homes were ruins, their loved ones often dead or missing. For them, the German withdrawal was liberation, but liberation through devastation. The price of breaking the Gustav Line was staggering. Over 55,000 Allied casualties had been sustained across the 4 battles of Cassino, representing soldiers from Britain, America, France, India, New Zealand, Morocco, and above all, Poland. German losses too were severe, estimated at 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Yet even in retreat, the Germans denied the Allies an easy victory. Their soldiers marched northward, battered but unbroken, determined to make the next line of defense just as costly. And so, as the smoke lifted from the shattered Abbey and the Allied armies poured into the Liri Valley, the war in Italy entered a new phase. The Gustav Line had fallen. The road to Rome lay open, but not undefended. Ahead loomed the Hitler Line, and beyond it, yet more mountains, rivers, and fortified positions. For the weary men who had endured Cassino, the battle was over. But for the campaign in Italy, the struggle was far from finished. The collapse of the Gustav Line and the weary German withdrawal marked more than just the end of the Battle of Cassino. It signalled the opening of the long-awaited road to Rome. For months, the Eternal City had hung like a distant prize, promised again and again to weary soldiers slogging through mud, rubble and minefields. Now, at last, the seemingly impregnable bastion of Cassino was behind them, and the Allies could turn their eyes northward. The path to the Italian capital, the first Axis capital that would fall in the war, lay open. The Liri Valley became the artery of this advance. What had once been choked by German guns and barbed wire now stretched out like a corridor of opportunity. Allied armour surged forward, rumbling past villages reduced to ruins, their turrets scanning every ridge for the telltale flash of German fire. Infantry units marched cautiously, bayonets fixed, wary of ambushes from rearguards still determined to stall the Allied push. Engineers worked frantically to repair demolished bridges and clear minefields, keeping the columns moving. Overhead, Allied aircraft patrolled constantly, strafing retreating convoys and bombing crossroads where German troops sought to regroup. Yet the march toward Rome was not a reckless dash. The Germans, though retreating, had not lost their skill at delaying actions. The Hitler Line, built beyond the Liri Valley, loomed as the next great obstacle. It was a fortified wall of steel and concrete bunkers, mined approaches and tank traps, designed to inflict further punishment on the advancing Allies. The memory of Cassino was still raw, and commanders understood that even with the Gustav line broken, a final breakthrough would require coordination, determination, and sacrifice. For the men who had fought at Cassino, Poles, New Zealanders, Indians, French North Africans, Britons, and Americans, the road to Rome carried with it a powerful sense of vindication. They had endured unspeakable hardship on the slopes of Monte Cassino, many believing they would never live to see victory. Now, as convoys pushed forward, battered soldiers allowed themselves a fleeting sense of triumph. They were not just advancing, they were liberating. Each step northward pushed back the shadow of tyranny, freeing villages and towns from the grip of Nazi occupation. For the Italian civilians, the advance carried even deeper meaning. Rome, though a capital of empire in ruins, remained a beacon of their national spirit, a symbol of survival through centuries of conquest and war. Word spread quickly through the countryside. Cassino had fallen, the Allies were moving north, and Rome would soon be free. Hope surged in whispers across ruined farmhouses and crowded shelters, mingling with the sobering memory of the devastation left behind. For many Italians, liberation would come at a terrible price, but it was liberation nonetheless. Politically, the fall of Cassino and the opening of the road to Rome reverberated far beyond Italy. To the Allies, it was proof that the campaign, so often criticized as a costly sideshow, was finally yielding strategic fruit. Winston Churchill, who had long pressed for the Italian campaign, could now point to Rome as justification for the months of blood and attrition. To Joseph Stalin in Moscow, the opening of Rome provided evidence that his Western allies were indeed striking at Germany from multiple directions, not leaving the Red Army to bear the burden alone. And to Adolf Hitler, the news was bitter. Another Axis capital was about to be pried from his grasp. By May's end, Allied momentum was unstoppable. German resistance, though fierce, could not fully blunt the advance. The capture of Cassino had broken the back of their defensive system south of Rome. The Eternal City, spared from the destruction that had engulfed Monte Cassino, lay only weeks away. Allied columns pressed onward, their banners carried by soldiers who had endured one of the most grueling battles of the war. Rome was no longer a distant dream, it was within reach, and its liberation would mark a turning point not only in the Italian campaign but in the entire struggle for Europe. Victory at Monte Cassino did not come cheaply. The shattered stones of the ancient Abbey and the churned mud of the Liri Valley concealed a truth that could not be dressed in triumph. The Allied path to Rome had been purchased in blood. Every nationality that had fought in that campaign, American, British, Indian, Polish, French, New Zealander, Canadian, Moroccan, Algerian, German, and Italian civilian, had paid a price so heavy that the very name Cassino became a synonym for sacrifice. The mountain may have been conquered, the Gustav line breached, but behind the banners of victory lay the silent witness of thousands upon thousands of dead. For the Americans, particularly the 34th and 36th Infantry Divisions, Cassino was a wound etched forever into their regimental histories. They had been among the first to attempt the assault in January, slogging through flooded valleys and icy rivers under ceaseless German fire. Whole companies had been lost in futile attacks across the Rapido River, their bodies left tangled in wire or swept away in the current. Veterans would later speak of Cassino as one of the most punishing ordeals they had endured in the entire European war, rivaling even the beaches of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. The British and Commonwealth forces bore their share of the dead with equal solemnity. Units from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland fought side by side with New Zealanders, Canadians, and South Africans, each leaving their sons upon those ridges and gullies. The Indian divisions, drawn from Punjab, Rajputana, and Gurkha regiments, earned a place of honour in the blood-soaked annals of Cassino. Gurkha soldiers scaled vertical cliffs to assault German positions, often armed with little more than rifles and their iconic kukris, yet many never returned from those heights. The cries of the wounded echoed through the shattered monastery walls long after the battle had passed, reminders of the Empire's distant sons who had fallen in a foreign land. The Poles, whose sacrifice became the final chapter of the Abbey's defense, carried a grief that was both national and personal. Driven by the hope of proving their nation's valor after years of occupation and betrayal, the Polish II Corps stormed the ruins in May 1944. Their assault was ferocious, unrelenting, and devastatingly costly. Hundreds fell among the rubble, their blood mingling with the stones of a monastery built by Saint Benedict. For the survivors, the raising of the Polish flag above the ruins was not a moment of triumph alone, but also of mourning. They knew that those who died there would never see their homeland again, still shackled under Nazi domination and destined to fall under Soviet control. The French Expeditionary Corps, made up largely of Moroccan Goumiers and Algerian tirailleurs, fought with ferocity through the Ourontsi Mountains, bypassing the strongest German defences. Their unconventional mountain warfare cracked open routes the Germans had believed impassable, but their progress came at terrible cost. The high passes and jagged peaks became fields of the fallen, where men accustomed to the deserts and plains of North Africa lay cold beneath Italian skies. Their victories opened the flanks of the Gustav line, yet the names of those who perished were often recorded only in silence, their graves scattered far from their native soil. For the Germans, Cassino was no less a graveyard. They had defended with skill, ferocity, and grim determination, turning every hilltop and stone wall into a fortress. The 1st Parachute Division in particular earned an enduring reputation, their stubborn stand becoming legendary. But legends were written in blood. Entire battalions withered under the ceaseless bombardment and relentless Allied assaults. When the order to withdraw finally came, many German commanders looked back at Cassino not with pride, but with sorrow, for they had sacrificed some of their finest troops in a defense that could only delay, not prevent, the inevitable Allied march. And then there were the civilians, the silent multitude caught between the hammer and the anvil. The town of Cassino, once a thriving Italian community, was reduced to dust and corpses, families huddled in caves or among the rubble enduring hunger, disease, and terror. The monastery itself, once a sanctuary of prayer and learning, had been reduced to an open wound upon the landscape, its treasures scattered, its monks displaced. For the Italian peasantry across the valleys, liberation often came hand in hand with ruin. Their homes were gone, their fields cratered, their loved ones buried beneath collapsed walls. When the guns finally fell silent at Cassino, the toll was staggering. Allied dead numbered in the tens of thousands. German losses were scarcely less. Civilian casualties remained uncounted, swallowed by the destruction. Cemeteries soon rose across the landscape, Polish graves on the mountain, Commonwealth crosses in the valleys, German headstones set apart in their own quiet fields. Each told the same story, that Cassino, for all its strategic importance, had been won not by brilliant maneuvers alone, but by endurance paid in flesh and spirit. The Mountains of the Dead became the unspoken monument of the campaign. To walk the ridges after the battle was to step through a silent army, helmets lying in ditches, rifles abandoned in the mud, boots protruding from shallow graves. The air was still heavy with the smell of cordite and decay. For those who had survived, Cassino was not merely a battlefield. It was a scar that would never heal. It was the price of breaking Hitler's defensive wall, the toll exacted for opening the road to Rome. Victory had been achieved, yes, but it had been purchased at a cost so immense that even in triumph there was only mourning. In the years that followed the gun's silence at Monte Cassino, the ruins of battle gave way to something deeper than mere rubble, memory. The mountain that had echoed with artillery, screams, and the clash of armies was transformed into a place of mourning and remembrance, where the cost of victory would never be forgotten. All across Cassino and the Liri Valley, cemeteries rose, carefully planned and meticulously tended, where soldiers from distant corners of the globe lay side by side in eternal rest. These hallowed grounds became not just burial sites, but symbols of shared sacrifice, reminders of how many nations had bled on that unforgiving slope. The Polish War Cemetery rests just below the rebuilt Abbey, a poignant reminder of the men who stormed the monastery ruins in May 1944. Row upon row of white crosses mark the final resting place of those who fought for a homeland they could not yet reclaim, their inscriptions etched with names that would never return to Warsaw, Krakow, or Lwów. At the entrance, an inscription reads, "For our freedom and yours," a testament to their belief that their blood spilled in Italy was part of a greater struggle for Europe itself. For surviving Polish veterans and their descendants, this cemetery became not only a graveyard but a fragment of Poland transplanted onto Italian soil. Nearby, the Commonwealth War Cemetery holds thousands of graves of British, Indian, New Zealand, South African, Canadian, and Australian soldiers. Its immaculately kept lawns stretch outward, serene against the rugged backdrop of the mountains where so many perished. Each headstone bears not only a name and regiment, but often a brief epitaph chosen by grieving families an ocean away. Words of love, sorrow, and remembrance carved into the stone. For the Indian divisions who fought here, memorials recall the valor of men from Punjab, Gurkhas from Nepal, and soldiers of many faiths, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Christian, all united in sacrifice on Italian soil. The United States also left its mark in the form of the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery at Nettuno, a vast expanse where thousands of white marble crosses stand in solemn alignment. Though not directly at Cassino, it remains linked in memory to the campaign, honoring those Americans who fell in the drive that Monte Cassino had made possible. The French Expeditionary Corps, too, erected monuments to the Moroccan Goumiers and other colonial troops, acknowledging both their heroism and the controversial shadow their presence left behind. German war cemeteries also exist, stark and understated, reflecting both the losses of the Wehrmacht and the painful legacy of their presence in Italy. Above all of these cemeteries, rebuilt brick by brick, stone by stone, stands the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino. Once shattered into rubble by the thunder of Allied bombs, it rose again after the war, reconstructed as both a functioning monastery and a symbol of endurance. For the monks who returned, the new abbey became a place of reconciliation where memory of war coexisted with prayer for peace. Its walls, spotless yet steeped in history, serve as a reminder of both destruction and renewal. Today, pilgrims, veterans, and descendants climb the same roads where tanks once ground uphill, entering a monastery that bears no scars on the surface but carries within it the weight of centuries and the memory of 1944. Monte Cassino today is more than a battlefield. It is a vast memorial landscape where nations converge to honor their dead. Commemorative ceremonies take place regularly, bringing together Poles, Italians, British, Americans, Indians, French, and even Germans, no longer enemies but united in remembrance. Wreaths are laid, flags are lowered, and silence falls over ground that once trembled with ceaseless fire. The survivors who return here in their twilight years speak not only of horror and loss, but also of fellowship, courage, and endurance. For younger generations who walk among the graves or enter the Abbey's quiet halls, Monte Cassino is a classroom without words, a place where the scale of human sacrifice becomes tangible, where the stones and crosses tell the story more clearly than books. The memory of Cassino endures not because it was one battle among many, but because it embodied the extremes of war: brutality, courage, destruction, and rebirth. The cemeteries and the rebuilt monastery stand as dual testaments, one to the dead who never left, and the other to the resilience of humanity to build again after devastation. In Monte Cassino, the world remembers not just a victory, but the price of that victory, carved forever into the mountains and carried in the silence of the graves. The Battle of Monte Cassino, fought across 4 grueling assaults from January to May 1944, stands as one of the defining struggles of the Second World War, not only for its immediate strategic importance, but for the lessons it etched into the history of warfare. Its legacy is layered, paradoxical, and enduring, a story of extraordinary courage set against unimaginable futility, of coalition strength strained under the weight of sacrifice, and of a campaign that shaped the course of the war in Italy while also revealing the limits of military power against terrain, weather, and stubborn defence. In the grand sweep of the Italian campaign, Monte Cassino was both gateway and graveyard. Strategically, the Allies needed to pierce the Gustav line, the formidable defensive belt stretching across the Apennines, if they were to liberate Rome and continue their advance northward. Cassino, with its Abbey looming like a fortress above the Liri Valley, became the keystone of this line, yet the cost of forcing that gateway was catastrophic. Months of bloody stalemate, tens of thousands of casualties, and a battlefield reduced to rubble. In the end, Rome fell, but the broader Italian campaign never became the decisive thrust into Europe that Allied leaders had envisioned. Instead, Italy became a drawn-out war of attrition, tying down German divisions but never delivering the knockout blow of Normandy. Cassino, in this sense, was both necessary and tragically wasteful. A battle that achieved its objectives but at a price that continues to haunt military historians. The battle also illuminated the challenges and triumphs of coalition warfare. On those slopes fought a mosaic of nations: British and Commonwealth soldiers, Poles, Indians, New Zealanders, Americans, French, Moroccans, Algerians, and Italians of the newly reconstituted co-belligerent army. Never before had such a diverse array of languages, cultures, and military traditions converged on a single battlefield. Coordination was often fraught. Misunderstandings in planning and execution cost lives. Yet it was also in coalition that the Allies found their strength. The Polish sacrifice in the final assault, the French Expeditionary Corps' daring mountain maneuvers, the determination of Indian divisions scaling near vertical slopes. All of these threads wove together to create the eventual victory. Cassino revealed the immense difficulty of coalition command, but also the undeniable truth that no single nation could have triumphed there alone. At the same time, Monte Cassino underscored the brutal limits of modern firepower when confronted with prepared defences and rugged terrain. The bombing of the Abbey, intended to clear a German stronghold, achieved the opposite. It transformed the monastery into a field of rubble ideally suited to defenders. The mountains, rivers, and ravines acted as force multipliers for the German troops, turning every advance into a bloodletting. Allied commanders learned that even overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, and aircraft could be blunted by the ground itself when combined with skillful defenders. Cassino thus became a grim lesson in the futility of brute force, reminding the world that courage and technology cannot always bend nature and fortification to their will. The human legacy of Cassino is perhaps its most enduring. The courage displayed on those ridges was of a kind that defies easy measure. Soldiers fought not just against an enemy, but against the weather, exhaustion, and despair. Men of vastly different backgrounds shared the same foxholes, endured the same artillery barrages, and mourned the same losses. To Poles, Cassino became sacred ground, where their national struggle was inscribed in blood. To Indians, it was a chapter of honor, a reminder of how soldiers from a colonized land fought with valor in a European war. To New Zealanders and Britons, it was a story of sacrifice in a campaign that sometimes felt overshadowed by other fronts. For Germans, it was a testament to defensive tenacity in the face of overwhelming odds. And for Italians, it was both tragedy and transformation, as their soil became the crucible of liberation at the cost of devastation. In the larger memory of the Second World War, Monte Cassino occupies a unique place. It lacks the clean narrative of Normandy's triumph, the decisive sweep of Kursk, or the symbolic resonance of Stalingrad. Instead, it stands as a reminder of war's ambiguity, a necessary battle fought at terrible cost, a victory that felt at times like defeat, and a moment of glory intertwined with despair. Its story is less about conquest and more about endurance. the capacity of men to persist in the face of hopeless odds, and of nations to cooperate despite discord. Today, the legacy of Monte Cassino lives on in the rebuilt monastery that crowns the mountain, in the cemeteries that spread across the valley, and in the quiet pilgrimage of descendants who walk those slopes to touch the past. It remains a lesson for soldiers and leaders alike, that courage can illuminate even the darkest fields of futility, that unity among nations can overcome the strongest of defenses, and that the cost of war must always be weighed not only in strategy but in the countless lives it consumes. Monte Cassino endures in memory not because it was simple, but because it was complex, an emblem of courage and futility, of victory and tragedy, of destruction and rebirth. In its ruins and its memorials lies the ultimate lesson of war, that humanity's greatest strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the resilience to remember, rebuild, and strive for peace.